She almost said no. After a stranger rode in and saved her ranch from the bank's cold hands, he sat down at her kitchen table and made her an offer, half of everything, in exchange for a real partnership. And every stubborn bone in Eliza Hartley's body wanted to refuse, because asking for help felt like surrender, because trusting a stranger felt like madness, because letting someone in, that was the most terrifying thing of all. What she didn't know yet was that her answer would decide not just the fate of the ranch, but the rest of her entire life. Welcome, this channel is your home for Western tales, woven from grit and grace, where cowboys carry quiet hearts, mothers move mountain, and love always arrives in the most unexpected forms. The story you're about to hear is a reminder that the walls we build to protect ourselves are sometimes the very things keeping out the life we deserve. Stay till the end, like what you hear, leave a comment with your thoughts, share with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe for more stories that hit somewhere deep.
That morning had dawned just as miserable as all the rest. Eliza Hartley was staring out her kitchen window, her daddy's coffee cup right where he left it 6 months back. A little circle of dust had formed around it like a tiny headstone. Outside, the New Mexico sun was already trying to bake the land, which was so dried out it was cracking up like an old saddle. The well was getting dangerously low. The cows were looking more like skeletons, and the bank's final letter was on the table. She only had to read it once for the words to be seared into her mind. Final notice. Amount due, $2,300. If payment was not made by October 15th, all property and assets would be seized immediately. And today was October 15th. She knew this day was coming. She could feel it on the wind, like a big storm you can see building, but cannot do a thing to stop. For 4 long months she had fought tooth and nail. She sold off anything that could be pried loose. She worked until her hands were raw and bleeding. She tried to keep the place afloat and make payments the bank would take, but it was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. The drought made sure of that. Then came the sickness that took half the herd in August. On top of it all, she was a 23-year-old woman, all by herself in a land that did not put much stock in a young lady's ability to handle business. Her daddy, Thomas Hartley, had built this place from scratch over 30 hard years. He pulled a life for his family right out of the dirt in his own pure grit. He raised horses so fine their reputation stretched across 3 territories. The man had lived through Indian raids, terrible dry spells, and blizzards that could freeze a herd solid. He made it through all of that, only to be taken by a freak accident with a scared horse and a rock in the wrong place last March. Her mama, Sarah Hartley, followed him just 2 months after. It seemed her heart just gave up on a world that did not have him in it. That left Eliza all alone, with not just a ranch, but the heavy debt her daddy took on to grow his horse business. It was a risk that would have paid back 10 times over, if only he had been given the time. But he was not. The crunch of wheels on the gravel path snapped her out of her thoughts. Her heart sank straight to her boots. They had arrived. 2 buggies, painted black as a funeral suit with the bank's emblem on the doors. She saw them come up the long drive, kicking up mean-looking clouds of dust. 4 men got out. 3 of them were strangers in stuffy city suits that had no business being in this heat. And the 4th man, she knew him. Vernon Hastings, the man from the bank. He was a man with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth, and shaking his hand felt like grabbing a cold fish. Eliza took a deep breath, pulled her shoulders back, and stepped out onto her porch. The morning heat smacked her in the face like a hot towel, and it was not even 9 o'clock. The wooden planks her father had put down with his own hands groaned under her feet, a sound that felt a lot like sorrow. She stood there at the top of the steps and just waited, folding her hands together so no one would see them tremble. Hastings walked up first. He tipped his hat like a gentleman, but the hungry look in his eyes gave him away. "Miss Hartley," he called out. His voice was full of that fake concern folks use right before they tear your world apart. I truly am sorry we are here today. Are you really? The words slipped out of Eliza's mouth, sounding much braver than she felt inside. For a second, something shifted in Hastings' expression, maybe irritation. Maybe he was just entertained. The bank provided you with every chance to handle this debt. Your father was a good customer of ours. We gave him that loan because we trusted him. My father died building a dream, Eliza replied. I have been trying to see it through. And with what money? Hastings asked, holding his hands out wide. Miss Hartley, you are 4 months behind. The debt, with all the interest and charges, is now $2,300. Can you pay that amount today? His question just dangled there in the heavy air. You already know I cannot, Eliza said, her voice barely a whisper. Well then, we must move forward with the foreclosure. Hastings waved a hand toward the men with him. This is Mr. Pembroke. He will be making a list of the property to be sold at auction. I will need you to leave the premises. Be gone by sundown. The words struck her hard. Gone by sundown. From the only house she had ever known. The house where her mama taught her letters, where her daddy spun tales by the fire about the old times, about creating something that would stand forever. And it would all be taken away by nightfall. This is my home, Eliza said, and she hated that her voice sounded so weak. This was your collateral, Hastings corrected her coldly. As of this morning, it is the property of the bank. That man Pembroke was already walking around with a little book and a pencil, taking notes. He eyed her family's belongings with the same interest a man might show a stack of old crates. The third man was a young deputy. He just stood there with his hand on his pistol, like he expected her to cause some kind of trouble. The horses, she said, a sudden desperation in her voice. Please, just let me have my horses. They were a separate business. My father had different account books for them. Hastings actually smiled then, and that was a whole lot worse than his frown. Everything located on this land is collateral, Miss Hartley. The horses, the cows, the tools. It will all be auctioned to pay the debt. If anything is left over after the bank gets its money, we will send it to you. But I would not hold your breath waiting for it. No, of course not. The bank would see to that. They would sell it all for next to nothing to their own friends. She would be left with absolutely nothing, not even the fare for a train ticket to anywhere else. Eliza felt the last bit of hope she was holding on to just shatter inside her. How much time do I have? She finished. Mr. Pembroke will need about 3 or 4 hours to finish his list, Hastings replied. You will need to stay here while he works in case he has questions. Afterwards, he gave a little shrug. I recommend you pack a bag with what you can carry and find another place to sleep. We will be locking up the house. And where am I supposed to go? Well now, Miss Hartley, that is hardly the bank's problem, is it? The coldness of his words just stole the air from her lungs. She had known this man her whole life. She had seen him at church picnics and town parades. Her own father used to play cards with him. And here he was, standing on her land, tearing her life to pieces without a flicker of remorse. Pembroke was already headed to the barn, his little book open. The deputy stood by the buggies, watching her with a look of pure boredom, like this was just another Tuesday for him. I will need to go inside the house now, Hastings announced, to take inventory. Eliza had the urge to tell him exactly where he could go. She wanted to run inside, slam that door and lock it tight. But she knew that would just make the deputy draw his weapon. Then she would not even get until sundown. She would just end up in a jail cell and the ranch would be gone all the same. So she moved out of his way. Hastings stomped up the porch stairs, his boots sounding loud on the old wood. He stopped at the doorway and looked back at her. For what it is worth, he said, I told the board to give you more time. But you are a young woman with no husband and no man in your family to speak for you. The bank. We simply cannot afford to carry unprofitable accounts forever. How mighty generous of you to even try, Eliza said, her voice as flat as the dry plains. A tight little smile appeared on Hastings' face. Being bitter is not going to change your circumstances, Miss Hartley. He turned and walked right into her house. Through that open door, Eliza could hear him rummaging around. Her house. He was opening drawers, scribbling notes, and taking stock of her entire life as if it were just inventory in a general store. She just stood there on the porch, frozen by a sadness so deep and wide it had no place to go. All around her, the ranch that had been her whole world was slowly dying. The windmill, desperately needing a fix, groaned in the hot wind. The fence along the east pasture drooped where the posts had rotted through. The beautiful garden her mother had once lovingly cared for was now just a patch of brown, dead stubble. Everything her father had poured his life into building, everything he had died fighting to keep, was just gone. Off in the distance, she saw Pembroke heading into the barn. She knew exactly what he would find in there. 8 horses, 2 of them mares about to have their foals, and the stallion Ranger that her father had spent a small fortune on 3 years back. They were magnificent creatures, every last one, and they would be sold off one by one, likely to folks who knew nothing about how to properly care for a horse. The breeding program her father had spent his whole life creating would be scattered to the 4 winds. Eliza shut her eyes, trying to force air into her tight chest. So this was how it all ended. Not with a bang or a fight, but with paperwork, appraisals, and polite men in suits taking her life apart, piece by piece. Her father's legacy was now just a few lines of ink in a ledger book. A sudden noise made her eyes fly open. A creak from inside told her that Hastings was now in her father's study going through his desk. She knew she should probably be in there, watching him, making sure he did not take anything. But she just could not make herself go. She could not bear the sight of a stranger's hands touching her father's personal things. So instead, she walked down the porch steps and out into the yard. She had to move, had to do something, anything other than just stand there and let this happen. The sun was climbing higher in the sky, promising another day of blistering heat. October in New Mexico was supposed to be a relief from the summer blaze. But this year, the drought had dug in its heels with a mean streak. The sky was a hard, brittle blue, with not a single cloud to be seen. There was no rain coming, just like there had not been any rain for months. And just like there was no help coming for her now. Without thinking, Eliza found herself walking toward the little family cemetery. It was a small piece of land on a hill that looked out over the whole ranch, surrounded by a wrought iron fence her father had specially ordered from a blacksmith in Santa Fe. Her parents were buried there, side by side, under 2 identical headstones. Thomas Hartley, 1821 to 1886. Sarah Hartley, 1825 to 1886. She stood at the foot of their graves and wondered what they would think if they could see her now. Would her father be ashamed of her for not being able to save his ranch? Would her mother tell her that she had done all she could? "I am so sorry," Eliza whispered to the quiet stones. "I tried. I really, really tried." The wind kicked up then, hot and dusty, blowing grit across the hilltop. In the distance, she could hear Hastings yelling out to Pembroke. Their voices carried across the empty land as they worked together, listing and cataloging, tearing her world apart. She had no idea how long she stood there. Time had gotten strange, stretching and snapping back. It felt like hours had passed, and only seconds, all at the same time. The sun beat down on her head. Sweat ran in a little river down her back. Her throat was bone dry, but the idea of going back to the house for a drink of water, her house that was about to belong to someone else, was more than she could stand. Finally, Hastings' voice broke through her daze. "Miss Hartley, I am going to need you back at the house." She turned and saw him standing on the porch, waving his arm at her like he was in a hurry. With feet that felt like lead, she walked back down the hill. As she got closer, she saw that Pembroke was back from the barn, his ledger now full of his scribbled notes. The deputy had moved over into the shade of a carriage, his hat pulled down low over his eyes. "I need you to sign these papers," Hastings said, pushing a stack of documents toward her. "This is to acknowledge that you have received the foreclosure notice and to confirm the inventory assessment." Eliza stared at the papers, but the words were just a blur. "And if I do not sign? Then the deputy will simply make a note of your refusal and the foreclosure will happen anyway. Your signature is just a courtesy, Miss Hartley. It is not required." Of course it was. She took the papers and the pencil Hastings held out. Her hand was trembling as she signed her name, Eliza Jane Hartley. On each of the lines he pointed to. Every time she wrote her name, it felt like a little piece of her died. "There," Hastings said, snatching the papers back with a satisfied look. "That is all settled. Mr. Pembroke, do you have the final numbers?" "The preliminary figures put the total value of the assets at around $1,800, Pembroke said, his voice whiny. "That is figuring in the condition of the buildings, the livestock, and what the market is like right now. $1,800. For a ranch her father had worked 30 years to build. For horses that were worth twice that amount, if you sold them right. For a house that had been a home to 3 generations of her family." "That will hardly cover what is owed on the principal," Hastings said with a frown. "What about the horses? That breeding stock ought to fetch a high price." "Not in this market," Pembroke said. "This drought is hurting everybody. Nobody is out buying fancy things like thoroughbred horses when they can barely afford to feed the animals they already have." Fancy things. That is what he called her father's life's work. "Well, I suppose we will just have to take what we can get," Hastings said. He turned his attention back to Eliza. "The auction is set for next Saturday in town. You are welcome to come, though I cannot imagine it will be very pleasant for you." "How thoughtful of you," Eliza said, her voice completely empty. Hastings pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. "It is almost noon. I believe we are done here, Miss Hartley. You have until sundown to get your personal things out of the house. Anything you leave behind becomes the property of the bank." 6 hours. She had 6 hours to go through 23 years of her life and figure out what little she could take with her. "I will need a wagon," she said, "to move my belongings." "I am afraid the wagon is considered part of the ranch's assets," Hastings said, "and it has already been listed." "Well, then, how in the world am I supposed to—" "You can hire a wagon in town, or maybe one of your neighbors would be kind enough to help you out." The way he said it made it clear he did not think that was likely. Out here, helping someone the bank was taking from was a sure way to get on the bad side of the very people who held everybody else's loans. Eliza felt hot tears sting the back of her eyes, and she blinked them away hard. She would not cry in front of these men. She would not give them the satisfaction. "Is there anything else?" she asked. "I will need the keys to the house before I leave. The house is not locked. It will be. The bank will have new locks put on tomorrow." Hastings held out his hand, waiting. Eliza almost laughed at how ridiculous it all was. She had never locked her doors a day in her life. Nobody out here did. But now the bank wanted keys. They wanted to seal up her home like it was a tomb. "I do not have any keys," she said. "We never needed them." Hastings let out a sigh, like this was some great personal trouble for him. "Then I will just have the new locks put on today. You will need to be done clearing out your personal items within the next few hours." Before she could even answer, a sound cut through the hot, still air. It was the sound of hoofbeats coming hard and fast. Everybody turned to look down the road. A rider was coming toward them, pushing his horse with a cloud of dust kicking up behind him like smoke. Even from far away, Eliza could see he was a tall man with broad shoulders, wearing one of those long, weathered dust coats that you see on a man who spends more time on the trail than he does in town. The rider did not slow down one bit as he got closer. If anything, he spurred his horse on, thundering down the last stretch of road before pulling back hard on the reins, stopping in a spray of dirt and gravel. The horse, a beautiful big gelding, sidestepped and snorted as the rider swung down out of the saddle like he had been born there. He was younger than Eliza first guessed, maybe in his early 30s, with skin tanned dark by the sun and eyes the color of a stormy sky. His jaw was covered with a few days of stubble, and his clothes, though dusty from his ride, looked to be good quality. A gun belt hung low on his hips, its holster worn smooth from years of use. "Well now," Hastings said, getting his composure back. "Can I help you, sir?" The stranger paid him no mind at all. His eyes had already found Eliza, and there was something in the way he looked at her. A flash of recognition, a hint of worry, made her breath hitch in her throat. "Are you Eliza Hartley?" he asked. His voice was low, with the gentle drawl of a man who grew up speaking Spanish before English. "I am," she answered, puzzled. "Do I know you?" "No, ma'am, but I know who you are. I've seen you around town." He glanced over at the buggies from Hastings and Pembroke, then at the deputy, and his jaw set hard. "Is this a foreclosure?" "That is not your concern, sir," Hastings said with a stiff upper lip. "This is bank business." "Well, I'm making it my concern." The stranger's hand was resting easy near his gun belt. "It was not a threat, but you surely noticed it." "Miss Hartley, are these fellas taking your ranch?" Eliza finally found her words. "Yes, I owe the bank some money. $2,300. And I just don't have it." The stranger's eyes, she saw them clearly now. They were gray like a cloudy sky before a winter storm. He looked her over, and his gaze was so direct it ought to have been uncomfortable, but for some reason it wasn't. $2,300, he said, more to himself than to her. "That is the total amount, plus fees and interest that will continue to accrue," Hastings chimed in. "Now, I don't think I got your name." "Mercer," the stranger said. "Caleb Mercer." He turned back to Eliza. "Ma'am, if you had the money right this second, would that stop all this? Would they just leave?" "Well, yes, but—" "How much is it exactly?" Caleb interrupted, his eyes fixed on Hastings. The bank manager's face went completely blank. "As I said, $2,300 plus—" "I heard you the first time," Caleb said flatly. "If I pay you that full amount right here and now, do these men get off this land, and does this woman get to keep her ranch?" A heavy silence fell over the whole yard. Hastings was the first to find his tongue. "Well, yes, if the debt was paid in full, the foreclosure action would be suspended. But, Mr. Mercer, "I'm not asking for a long story," Caleb said, his voice flat as a griddle. "I'm asking if you'll take the payment right now. And if you do, will you leave?" "Yes," Hastings finally said, and Eliza could hear the doubt plain in his voice. "But, Mr. Mercer, $2,300 is a mighty large sum of money. I don't think—" Caleb Mercer was already turning to his horse and reaching into his saddlebag. Eliza just stood there, stuck in place, as he pulled out not one but two heavy leather pouches. They made a clinking sound as he walked. He went right past Hastings to where Pembroke stood with his book and emptied the first pouch right onto the buggy's running board. A river of gold coins spilled out, shining and glittering in the sun. "Start counting," Caleb said. Pembroke just gawked at the money like he had never seen a coin in his life. Hastings shoved him aside, his eyes as big as saucers. "Where did you get this money?" "That ain't any of your concern," Caleb said, throwing the banker's own words right back at him. "It's good and legal money, ain't it? So get to counting." With hands that were visibly shaking, Pembroke started sorting the coins into neat little stacks. Eliza watched, her heart pounding so hard she figured everyone in the whole county could hear it. This could not be real. This stranger, a man she'd never laid eyes on before, could not be paying off her entire debt. Things like this just did not happen. Not to her, not today. But the coins kept clinking while Pembroke counted, his lips moving without a sound. 1,000, he finally announced. Caleb opened the second pouch. More gold coins joined the pile. 2,000. He pulled out a third, smaller pouch. 2,200. Then Caleb reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a fistful of silver dollars. "That ought to cover the rest of it and your fees." The final tally came to $2,350. Hastings stared at the pile of money like it had just insulted his mother. "Mr. Mercer, I have to tell you, this is all highly irregular, taking on another person's debt without any proper legal advice." "I don't need a lawyer to tell me what to do," Caleb said. "You told me if the debt was paid, you'd leave. It's paid. So it's time for you to go." "There are procedures." "Then follow 'em. Write up whatever papers you need to write. But you'll be doing it knowing her debt is paid in full, which means this here foreclosure is done. Ain't that right?" Hastings' mouth opened and closed a few times. At last, he choked out, "Yes, if the debt is paid in full, the foreclosure is suspended. But, Mr. Mercer, you need to understand that by paying Miss Hartley's debt, you don't get any kind of claim on this property. The debt would just be transferred." "I understand how debt works," Caleb cut him off. "Write up your papers confirming you've been paid. Miss Hartley and I will figure out the rest of it ourselves." Eliza finally found her own voice. I don't understand what is happening." Caleb turned to face her, and for the very first time since he rode up, his hard expression softened just a little. "What's happening, ma'am, is that these men are leaving, and you are keeping your ranch." "But why? You don't even know who I am." "No, ma'am," he agreed. "But I know what it feels like to watch somebody lose everything they've got to men who just don't give a damn. And I know I have some money I've been saving up for a piece of land. Seems to me this land right here is worth saving." It was crazy. It was impossible. And yet it was happening right in front of her. Hastings, realizing he had lost all control of the situation, started gathering up the money with Pembroke's help, counting it one more time just to be sure. The deputy had stood up straight, his hand well away from his pistol, just watching the whole thing unfold with a look of pure confusion. "I'll be needing a receipt," Caleb said, "written out and signed, stating that the debt of $2,300 owed by Miss Eliza Hartley to the Territorial Bank has been paid in full on this day, October the 15th, 1886. "I'll have to draw up the official documents back at the bank," Hastings grumbled. "Then you'll bring 'em here tomorrow. But I want a signed receipt today before you ride off this property." Hastings' jaw was tight, but he pulled out a piece of paper and started writing. The scratching of his pen sounded way too loud in the quiet yard. When he was done, he shoved the paper at Caleb, barely hiding his anger. Caleb took his time reading it over before he folded it up and put it in his pocket. "Pleasure doing business with you," he said, and his tone made it clear it had been anything but a pleasure. Hastings turned to Eliza. "Miss Hartley, you should know that while your immediate problem has been taken care of, you now owe this money to Mr. Mercer. I would strongly advise you to speak with a lawyer about the repayment terms." "She'll handle her own affairs the way she wants," Caleb said before Eliza could even open her mouth. "Now, I do believe you gentlemen were on your way out." It was not a question. Hastings looked like he wanted to put up a fight. But one look at Caleb Mercer standing there, as calm and steady as a rock, seemed to make him change his mind. He gave a sharp nod to Pembroke and the deputy. "Pack up the books. We are finished here." The three men climbed back into their buggies, looking a whole lot less sure of themselves than when they had arrived. As the driver got ready to leave, Hastings leaned out the window. "I will be back tomorrow with the proper documentation," he called out. "I'll be looking forward to it," Caleb answered. Eliza just stood there, frozen, as the carriages kicked up dust on their way back down the road. She kept her eyes on them until they vanished around a curve, until the rattle of the wheels was completely gone. Only then did she look at the man who had just saved her whole world. Caleb Mercer was standing there with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops, looking right at her with those stormy gray eyes. His horse, forgotten in all the commotion, had found its way to the water trough and was drinking like it had been a week. "I still do not understand," Eliza said again. "Why did you do that? You paid $2,300 for what?" "For the chance to make you an offer," Caleb replied, "if you are open to hearing it." "An offer?" "Yes, ma'am. But first I figure we ought to get out of this sun. I've been riding since before dawn, and I reckon your morning has been a sight harder than you planned." Eliza glanced back at the house. Her house, which was somehow, unbelievably, still hers. She felt tears welling up again. But this time it was not all sorrow. "Yes," she said. "Yes, let us go inside." She led him up the wooden porch steps, her legs feeling unsteady and her head spinning. Behind them, Caleb's horse finished its drink and started to pick at the few sad-looking patches of grass left in the yard. The house was just as she had left it, or rather, as Hastings had left it, with desk drawers pulled open and papers thrown about where he had been taking inventory. She felt a hot flash of shame at the mess, The sheer poverty of it all laid bare for a stranger to see. But Caleb did not seem to pay it any mind. He took off his hat the moment he crossed the threshold, waiting for her to tell him where to go. "The kitchen," Eliza heard her own voice say. "I can put on some coffee." "That would be mighty kind of you, ma'am." She went through the old familiar motions, pumping water from the well, measuring out the coffee grounds, and stirring the coals in the stove. Her hands were shaking, but at least they had a job to do. Behind her, she heard Caleb pull out one of the chairs at the kitchen table, the old wood groaning under his weight. "You mentioned you had seen me in town," Eliza said, keeping her back to him. "When was that?" "A few times over this past year," Caleb said. "You were usually picking up supplies. I saw you once at the feed store when I was selling a horse to the owner, and another time at the church picnic last 4th of July. Eliza had a fuzzy memory of that day. It was one of the last times she had felt anything close to normal before the grief and the debt had swallowed everything whole. But she could not place his face. "I do not remember seeing you," she confessed. "Most folks don't. I am not one to make a big fuss." The coffee pot started to bubble. Eliza took down 2 cups, her father's and her mother's, the ones with the little blue flowers painted on them, and placed them on the table. "You said you had an offer for me," she said, finally turning around to look at him. Caleb Mercer seemed older in the light of the kitchen, the lines around his eyes cut a little deeper. But his gaze was unwavering and honest. "I do. But before I say my piece, I need to ask you something. Do you truly want to keep this ranch?" "Of course I do," Eliza answered without a second thought. "This is my home. My father built this place. He died trying to protect it. But do you want to do the work of running it, or do you just want to hold on to it because it was his?" The question took her by surprise. "Both, I suppose. I know how to run this ranch. My daddy taught me everything. I can handle the horses, manage the breeding and the debt, the drought, and the fact that you will be 4 months behind come February, unless a miracle happens." The plain, hard truth of his words felt like a slap. "I will find a way. I will just have to work harder, sell more horses." "With what breeding stock?" Caleb asked gently. "And forgive me for being so blunt, ma'am, but I had a look in your barn when I rode in. You have got 8 horses left, and only 2 of them are expecting. That is not enough to build a profitable operation, not in these times. Your father, he might have had the money and the connections to pull through. You do not. Not right now." Eliza sank into the chair across from him, feeling the wind knocked out of her. "So, what are you saying? That I should just let it go?" "No. I am saying you need a partner, and I am offering to be that partner." The coffee pot let out a sharp whistle. Eliza stood up like she was in a trance, poured 2 cups and set one down in front of Caleb. The simple, normal act felt completely strange. "What kind of help?" she asked. Caleb folded his hands around the warm cup, but did not take a sip. "I have been pushing cattle for 12 years, he said. "Started when I was 18, working for outfits all over Texas and up in Colorado. I have spent every season on the trail and saved every penny I earned. I have been looking for a piece of land to call my own, a place to start my own herd. But good land is hard to find. And when you do find it, there is always somebody with deeper pockets or better friends who gets to it first. So, you want to buy my ranch?" "No." Caleb looked her straight in the eye. "I want to partner with you. A real partnership. 50-50 ownership. I will put up all the capital I have saved. There is plenty more where that $2,300 came from. You put up the land, the horses you have left, and what you know about breeding them. We run this place together. We split the profits, we split the risk, and we split the work." Eliza just stared at him. "You want to go into business with a woman you just met. I know you did not quit when your folks passed away. I know you have been fighting for 4 months to hold on to this place, and I know you stood up to those bankers even when you had nothing left to fight with." He paused for a moment. "And I know you love this ranch enough to work yourself to death trying to keep it. That tells me everything I need to know. But why? Why not just wait for the bank to foreclose again? You could buy someone else's land for cheap. Because that is not the kind of man I want to be, Caleb said, his voice low and steady. I watched my own mother lose her farm after my father died. I watched the bank take every last thing while our neighbors just stood there saying how sorry they were but not lifting a finger. I swore to myself that if I ever got the money, I would never just stand by and watch that happen to somebody else. Not if I could do something to stop it. Eliza felt a lump form in her throat. I cannot pay you back. Not $2,300. It would take me years. I am not asking you to pay me back. I am asking you to build something with me. If we succeed, we both make money. If we fail, we both lose out. That is what being partners is all about. It was the craziest thing she had ever heard. And yet, what about the cattle? She asked. You said you are a cattleman. I do not know the first thing about raising cattle. And I do not know much about horse breeding past the basics, Caleb said. But between the two of us, we would have it all covered. I bring in a herd of cattle and you build up the horse operation. This ranch has good water even with the drought. That little creek out back is fed by a deep spring. If we manage the herd right, we could run a small cattle operation right alongside your horses. The bank said the horses were not worth much in this market. The bank was trying to steal them from you. Your stock is worth a fortune to the right people. And I know those people from my years on the cattle trails. I know ranchers who need good, solid working horses and will pay top dollar for animals with strong bloodlines. Eliza's mind was spinning. How would this work on paper? How can I be sure you will not just push me out once we are partners? We will have a lawyer draw up the papers proper. 50-50 ownership, with an equal say in every single decision. We can ride into town tomorrow, talk to a lawyer, and make it all official. If you want to add things in there to protect yourself, we will put them in. This is not a handout, Miss Hartley. It is a business deal. I need land and a place to invest my money. You need cash and another set of hands. We both need this to work. Why both horses and cattle? Why not stick to one or the other, to spread out the risk? Your father was smart to get into horse breeding, but he put all his eggs in one basket. The drought came, the cattle market went south, and suddenly no one was buying fancy horses. But if you have both, one business can carry the other when times get tough. It is just common sense. He was right, and she knew it. She had thought the very same thing these past few months, as she watched her father's dream crumble, because it was tied to just one thing. And you would live here? She asked. On the ranch? I cannot very well run an operation from town. That would be... People would talk. Let them talk. We are business partners. He stopped, and for the first time Eliza saw a little bit of color rise in his face. It would all be respectable. I can sleep in the barn, or we can build a small cabin for me, whatever you think is right. Eliza looked down into her coffee cup, her mind turning it all over. Her mind was spinning. This man had just stopped her from losing everything. He was giving her a chance not just to get by, but maybe even to build something better. But saying yes meant forever changing how she saw her father's ranch, admitting that she just could not do it all on her own. Can I think on it for a bit? She asked softly. Of course. You take all the time you need. Caleb paused. Well, maybe not all the time. The debt's taken care of for now, but winter is coming on fast. We'd have to make some decisions about the stock, getting feed and fixing up the place. The longer we put it off, the harder it'll get. How long have you been planning this? Eliza asked, catching him off guard. Caleb had the good sense to look a little sheepish. About 2 months now. I heard talk in town that you were behind on your payments. I started asking around, learned a little about your situation. I thought about coming to you sooner, but... He shrugged his shoulders. It felt a bit forward to offer help before it was truly needed. And you just happened to ride up today of all days. I knew the date of the foreclosure. It was not hard to figure out when I needed to be here. That was a heck of a gamble. What if I'd already lost the ranch before you even got here? Then I reckon I would have bought it at the auction and come offered you a job as my foreman, Caleb said, simple as that. Either way, it just seemed wrong to let good land and a fine horse operation go to ruin. Eliza did not know if she should be impressed by his practical nature or a little unsettled by it. "I need to see your capital," she said. "If we are going to be partners, I need to know what else you're bringing to this besides the money you just paid for my debt." "That's fair," Caleb stood up. "I've got all my paperwork right here in my saddlebag. Bank statements, letters of credit, a list of livestock I own that's currently with a cattle outfit down in Colorado. It should give you a pretty clear picture, a proper understanding." They stepped back into the yard. The sun had already passed high noon and was beginning its long, slow slide toward evening. Caleb's horse had found a sliver of shade and was resting on 3 legs. Caleb walked to his saddlebag and took out a portfolio made of leather. Inside, he had neatly organized papers, including bank statements from Denver and Santa Fe. There were letters from managers of cattle outfits confirming he owned breeding bulls and several hundred head of mixed animals. He even had a letter of reference from a Colorado rancher whose name Eliza knew. She read every document twice. The figures were enough to make her head spin. Even after settling her debt, Caleb Mercer would have almost $4,000 in cash, not to mention livestock worth at least that much more. She said, "You must have been saving for a very long time." He replied, "Since I turned 18. Every dollar I did not need to live on went straight into the bank. I figured one day I would have enough to buy my own land, but like I told you, good land is hard to find. And now you are willing to gamble all of this on a partnership with a woman you hardly know." "I am willing to gamble on someone who has shown she does not give up," Caleb corrected her gently. "Sometimes that is more important than experience." Eliza handed the portfolio back to him. Her heart was beating hard in her chest. This was either the best decision she would ever make or the worst, and she would not know which one it was until it was far too late. "If we go forward with this," she said carefully, "we need to have rules and very clear lines." "I agree," he said. "I need the final word on everything that has to do with the horses. That includes breeding, sales, and how they are trained. That was my father's area of skill, and now it is mine. And I will have the final word on all cattle business. But for decisions that impact the entire ranch, like big purchases, land work, or hiring help, we have to decide together." "What happens if we do not agree?" she asked. "Then we will talk it out until we can find a middle ground. And if that does not work, we can ask someone else to help settle it, maybe the lawyer, or another person we both trust." His proposal was fair, more than fair, but Eliza still felt like she was standing at the edge of a great cliff about to take a leap. "I have one more question," she said. "Why are you not married? Why are you out here by yourself instead of raising a family on a ranch with a wife?" Caleb's face tightened just for a moment. "I was engaged one time 5 years ago. She decided she did not want to be married to a man who was gone 8 months of the year working with cattle. I cannot say that I blame her. This kind of life is not for everybody." "And you did not try to find someone else?" "I spent the last 5 years putting my energy into saving money and learning the trade. It did not seem right to ask a woman to put her life on hold while I was building my own." He paused for a moment. "What about you? You are young and very capable. Why is there not a husband here helping you manage this place?" "Because the kind of men who showed interest in me wanted a wife, not a partner in business," Eliza said plainly. "They wanted a woman to cook their meals, clean their house, and give them children while they ran the ranch. My father taught me how to manage the work, how to understand contracts, how to breed fine horses. Most men seem to find that threatening instead of appealing." "That is their loss," Caleb said, and he sounded like he truly believed it. They stood there in the yard as the afternoon heat settled around them. Two complete strangers thinking about tying their futures to one another. "I need until tomorrow," Eliza said at last. "I need to think this through properly to be sure I am not just She waved a hand in the air, making a choice out of just about losing the whole spread today. That is a wise way to look at it, Caleb agreed. I will head on into town, get a room at the boarding house, and come back in the morning. You can tell me what you have decided then. If it is yes, we will ride in together and see the lawyer. If it is no, he shrugged his shoulders. Well, the debt is still paid and you have got some breathing room to figure out your next move. And if I say no, you will just walk away after spending $2,300? You can consider it an investment in doing the right thing, Caleb said. Sometimes, that just has to be enough. He gathered his horse's reins and swung up into the saddle with a practiced ease that spoke of a life spent on horseback. Looking down at her, his expression was serious, but there was a kindness in his eyes. Miss Hartley, I know this is a whole lot to take in, and I know you have got no reason on earth to trust me beyond what I did today. But I want you to know, if we do this, I am all in. I do not quit on partnerships, and I sure do not quit on the land. Your father built something here that is worth protecting. It would be an honor to help you keep on building it. Before Eliza could find the words to respond, he tipped the brim of his hat and turned his horse toward the road. She watched him ride away, dust kicking up behind the bay gelding's hooves. She watched until he was just a dark shape against the horizon, and then nothing at all. Then she turned and looked at her ranch, still hers, against every odd. The barn needed new shingles. The fences were in dire need of mending. The well pump was making a terrible grinding noise that meant something inside was about to give out. The pastures were burnt brown from the drought. The cattle market was down, and winter was coming with all of its troubles. But the ranch was still here. It was still hers. The question was whether it should stay only hers or, if accepting help, accepting a partner was the smarter and braver choice. Eliza walked back into the house. Her father's old coffee cup was still sitting on the shelf, collecting dust. She picked it up, turning it over and over in her hands. What would you do, Papa? She asked the quiet room. But deep down, she already knew the answer. Her father had been a practical man above all else. He had partnered with other ranchers when it made good sense, borrowed money when he needed the capital, and hired good men and paid them a fair wage. He never once let his pride get in the way of doing what was necessary for the ranch. Eliza set the cup down and went into her father's study. The papers that Hastings had scattered all over were still there. There were loan documents, breeding records, and letters with buyers from across 3 territories. She spent the rest of that afternoon putting them all in order, reading through her father's notes, and understanding for the very first time just how complicated the whole operation had been. She realized how impossible it would be for just one person to manage it all alone. As the sun began to set, painting the New Mexico sky in brilliant shades of orange and crimson, Eliza stood on the porch. She watched the land her father had loved so dearly disappear into the twilight. Tomorrow, Caleb Mercer would be back, and tomorrow, she would give him her answer. Eliza woke up before the sun, her mind already made up, though she could not say exactly when the decision had settled. Maybe it happened while she was reading through her father's careful breeding records, seeing the years of planning that she just could not let go to waste. Or maybe it was the simple, undeniable fact that Caleb Mercer had ridden into her life at the exact moment she needed saving. And turning away from that felt not only foolish but also ungrateful to whatever power had sent him her way. She dressed in her most practical work clothes, a split riding skirt, and one of her father's old shirts with the sleeves rolled up, and went out to tend to the horses before the day got too hot. The morning air was cool, almost cold. A clear reminder that winter was going to show up whether she was ready for it or not. Ranger the stallion nickered softly as she came to his stall. She ran a hand along his powerful neck, feeling the strong muscles under the glossy coat her father had been so proud of. "We are going to be all right," she told him in a soft voice. "I think we are actually going to be all right." The horse just huffed and nudged her shoulder, seeming more interested in his breakfast than in her words of comfort. By the time she had finished feeding and watering all 8 horses, the sun was just starting to climb over the horizon, flooding the yard with a warm golden light. She was carrying water buckets back from the pump when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road. Caleb Mercer rode in with the sunrise right at his back, looking like a character straight out of a dime novel. His bay gelding moved with a long, ground-eating stride of a horse that was used to traveling long distances, and Caleb himself sat in the saddle with the natural grace of a man who had spent more of his life on a horse than on his own 2 feet. He reined in his horse near the porch, and his eyes met hers right away. "Morning, Miss Hartley." "Morning." Eliza set the buckets down and wiped her hands on her skirt. "You are early. Did not want to waste daylight if you had made up your mind." He paused for a moment, and she could see a little tension in the set of his shoulders despite his casual tone. "Have you?" "I have," Eliza said, taking a breath. "My answer is yes. I will accept your partnership offer." Something in Caleb's expression changed. It might have been relief, though he hid it mighty quick. He swung down from his horse and stood facing her across the dusty yard. "Are you certain?" he asked. "No second thoughts?" "Plenty of second thoughts," Eliza admitted. "But that first thought, it just keeps winning out. I cannot do this alone, and you are offering a fair solution. More than fair, really. Seeing as you have already paid off the debt with no guarantee, I would say yes." "Then we ought to head into town," Caleb said. "Get the legal work started before anything else has a chance to go wrong." "Should I saddle a horse?" "It might be easier if we took a wagon. We will need to bring some documents, and there will be papers to bring back. Unless your wagon was already—" "No," Eliza cut in. "Hastings was lying about that too. The wagon is mine. I just did not want to argue with him about every little thing." A small smile touched the corner of Caleb's mouth. "Smart woman. Know which fights are worth fighting." They hitched up Eliza's wagon, a sturdy farm rig her father had built with his own 2 hands, and started toward town. The ride was quiet at first. It seemed both of them were not quite sure how to handle this new arrangement. They were not exactly strangers anymore, but they were not quite partners yet either. They were in some strange space in between, and the silence felt heavier because of it. Finally, Caleb spoke up. "Tell me about the horses, your breeding program. What was your father's vision?" Eliza glanced over at him, grateful he had picked a safe topic. "He wanted to develop a line of horses that had the endurance of Mustang stock mixed with the size and strength of thoroughbreds. Working horses that could go all day in rough country but still had the speed and good sense for ranch work. He had been working at it for 15 years, choosing his bloodlines very carefully." "And Ranger is your foundation stallion?" "Yes. Papa bought him from a breeder in Kentucky. It cost him nearly every penny he had saved at the time. But he said the moment he laid eyes on that horse, he just knew. Said Ranger had the confirmation he had been dreaming of." "And the mares?" "3 are daughters of our old stallion. Papa always kept the best fillies from each generation. 2 are Mustang crosses with good, strong bone structure. And the 2 pregnant ones are the first of Ranger's foals. If they throw true, those babies will be the proof of the idea Papa was working toward." Caleb was quiet for a minute, taking it all in. "When are they due?" "Late December or early January, right in the dead of winter, of course." "It is always the way, is it not?" He shook his head. "We will need to make sure the barn is sealed up tight. The last thing we need is newborn foals getting pneumonia." The casual way he said "we" sent a small shiver of relief through Eliza. It was real. This was actually happening. "What about your cattle?" she asked. "You said you have stock up in Colorado." 300 head mixed breeds. Mostly Herefords, with some Longhorns for their hardiness. They are currently with an outfit I worked for last season. The foreman is holding them for me. I paid the winter grazing fees before I left. Come spring, I can either sell them and use the capital here, or we can drive them down to New Mexico if we have got the range for it. "The Arroyo pasture could probably support 100 head, Eliza said, thinking out loud. "Maybe more if we rotate the grazing right. But 300, not all at once. We would sell off what we do not need. Keep a good breeding nucleus. Build it up slow. The key is to never overgraze. That is how you kill the land." "Good." They became quiet again, but this time it was a more relaxed silence. The talk had put them on equal footing. Both were bringing skills to the table, and both were committed to making the partnership succeed. The town of Socorro seemed to appear from the dusty plains like something from a dream. It was a group of adobe and wood buildings built around a main square, with a church steeple reaching up toward the sky. Although it was early, the streets were already alive with merchants setting up their stalls, ranchers delivering goods, and children running errands before school started. Eliza could feel people watching them as they rode through the town. She knew exactly what they were seeing. A young woman riding alongside a man they did not know, looking like they knew each other well. The rumors would spread through the whole town before noon. She thought, let them talk. Caleb did not seem to notice the stairs at all. His focus was on trying to find the lawyer's office. They found it on a side street close to the courthouse. It was a small building with a wooden sign that read, Arthur Piton, Attorney at Law. I hope he's not related to the man from the bank, Eliza said under her breath. The name is spelled differently, Caleb noted, pointing at the sign. And even if he were, when it comes to the law, money speaks much louder than family. They tied up the wagon and walked inside. The office was small but neat. Bookshelves filled with law books stood against the walls, and the desk was covered in stacks of papers. A man who looked to be in his 50s glanced up from his work, with spectacles resting on his nose. Can I help you folks? He asked. We need to have partnership papers written up, Caleb stated, for a ranching business, legally sound and binding. Mr. Piton raised his eyebrows just a little. I see. And who am I speaking with? Caleb Mercer, and this is Miss Eliza Hartley. She is the owner of the Hartley Ranch, northeast of town. Ah, yes, I am familiar with it. Your father was Thomas Hartley, correct? The lawyer asked, looking at Eliza. He was. He was a good man. I was truly sorry to learn of his death. Mr. Piton pointed to the chairs in front of his desk. Please have a seat. Now you want to create a business partnership for a ranch. What kind of terms did you two have in mind? Over the next hour, they worked through all the specific points. 50-50 ownership. Equal power to make decisions in their own areas of knowledge. Rules for sharing profits, handling disagreements, and even ending the partnership if it became necessary. Mr. Piton asked sharp questions, making certain that both of them fully grasped what they were getting into. Miss Hartley, he said at one point, you realize that by agreeing to this partnership, you are effectively giving Mr. Mercer half ownership of a property that has belonged to your family for 3 decades. I do. And you are comfortable with that? Eliza looked the lawyer right in the eye. Mr. Mercer paid my debt yesterday when the bank was about to take my land. Without his help, I would have lost everything. With him, I have a chance to keep my family's ranch alive and make it successful. Yes, I am comfortable. Mr. Piton then looked at Caleb. And you, sir, are investing a large amount of money into a property you have never worked, with a partner you just met. Does that seem like a smart business move to you? It does, Caleb answered simply. I have looked into the property values, I have studied the breeding records Miss Hartley provided, and I have checked the quality of the land myself. The foundation is strong. What it needed was money to operate and more help, both of which I can supply. The lawyer looked at them both for a long moment, and then he just shrugged. Well, it is your lives. I will write up the documents. It will take me a couple of days to get all the papers drawn up right and proper. In the meantime, the lawyer said, I reckon you both ought to think long and hard about what you're getting into. A partnership can be the best thing in the world, or it can sink you faster than a rock in the Brazos. The difference usually comes down to how well you talk to each other. We will be fine, Eliza said, with a whole lot more certainty than she was feeling. They left that lawyer's office with a firm handshake and a promise to be back in 3 days to sign on the dotted line. As they walked toward the wagon, Caleb spoke up. We ought to stop at the general store. If we are going to start working this ranch proper, we will need some supplies. I do not have much to spare, Eliza confessed. I do. Just think of it as a down payment on our shared expenses. At the general store, they got more than a few looks, Mrs. Henderson, the owner's wife, looked like she was about to bust with questions, but she settled for a smile that was sweeter than molasses. "Miss Hartley, how wonderful to see you. And Mr. Mercer?" Caleb just nodded. "Ma'am." They bought what they needed for the ranch to run, things like fencing wire, nails, and lamp oil. They got coffee, flour, salt pork, and beans. Caleb picked up a brand new axe and a good coil of rope. Eliza, feeling strangely like a homemaker, tossed in some fabric to make curtains for the winter. As they were loading everything into the wagon, a voice called out, "Eliza Hartley, is that really you?" Eliza turned to see Margaret Sullivan coming her way, a girl she had known since they were little kids. Margaret's eyes were just sparkling with curiosity. "Maggie," Eliza said, forcing a smile onto her face. "It is good to see you. And you. I heard the wildest rumor just yesterday, something about the bank trying to take your ranch." "They sure did try," Eliza said, her voice steady as a rock. "The debt has been settled." "Oh, thank goodness. But how in the world did you—" Margaret's gaze shifted over to Caleb, who was standing by the wagon. "Oh, I get it." Eliza could almost hear the gears turning in her head. "Maggie, this here is Caleb Mercer. He is going to be my business partner. We are running the ranch as a team. Business partner." The way Margaret said it made it sound like something else altogether. "Well, ain't you forward-thinking?" "It is a proper partnership," Eliza said, her voice getting a little crisp. "We are having papers drawn up and everything." Of course, of course. I am sure it is all perfectly respectable." Margaret smiled in a way that showed she did not believe that for a second. "Well, I really have to run. Mother is waiting for me over at the dressmaker's, but we simply must have tea soon, Eliza. I am just dying to hear every last detail about your new arrangement." She turned and swept away in a rustle of fabric, her eyes already searching for the next person to tell. "Well now," Caleb said with a dry tone, "that went about how I figured it would." "It is going to be like that for a while," Eliza said, feeling her face get warm. "Folks are going to talk. They will draw their own conclusions. Let 'em talk. We know what is true, and that is all that counts." Caleb pulled himself up onto the wagon seat. "Besides, once they see us working hard and running this place right, they will find somebody else to gossip about." Eliza sure hoped he was right, but she had a feeling he was wrong. Small towns never forget, and they sure do love a good story. They started heading back to the ranch, the wagon groaning with the weight of their supplies. About halfway home, Caleb finally spoke. "I have been turning something over in my mind about the living situation." A knot formed in Eliza's stomach. "Yes," she said, "the barn is all right for the time being, but it is not going to be worth a darn come winter. And if we are going to make this partnership, if I am going to be working here for the long haul, I will need a decent place to stay. I figure we could build a room onto the house. It would need its own entrance and a stove for heat, which will cost a bit, but it would be a sound investment." "That sounds reasonable," Eliza said, feeling a wave of relief that he was thinking it through like a sensible man. "Or," Caleb went on, "if you would rather keep things more separate, I could put up a small cabin down by the barn. It would take more time, but we would both have our privacy." "The addition makes more sense," Eliza said, making up her mind. "The house is built solid, and we would save on building materials. Besides, with two of us running this ranch, it is probably smart to have someone nearby in case of an emergency." "A fair point. I will get started on it next week as soon as we get the partnership papers all signed." They fell quiet again, but Eliza's mind was racing. She was about to share her home, not just the ranch, but her actual house, with a man she hardly knew. It was practical, and it was necessary, but Lord have mercy, it was a scandal by most folks' standards. Her mother would have thrown a fit. Her father, though, her father just might have understood. When they got back to the ranch, they passed the afternoon unloading all the supplies and figuring out which repairs needed doing first. Caleb's experienced eyes saw things Eliza had either overlooked or just did not know how to fix. "That stretch of fence is about to give way," he said, pointing out toward the east pasture. "The posts are rotted clear through. We are going to need to replace at least 20 of them." "I know," Eliza admitted. "I just never had the time or the wood. Well, we have got both now. I will make a start on it tomorrow." They worked alongside each other for the rest of the afternoon. Caleb checked over the buildings and the equipment while Eliza saw to the horses. She found herself sneaking glances at him when she figured he was not looking. She watched the capable way he moved, the close attention he gave every little detail, and the respect he showed for her father's hard work, even while pointing out its shortcomings. As the sun started dipping low, Eliza realized she had not had a bite to eat since breakfast. "I ought to start supper," she announced. "Are you? I mean, you are welcome to eat with me since we are partners and all." Caleb looked up from a gate hinge he was studying. "I would appreciate that, ma'am, but I can surely cook for myself if you would rather." "Do not be silly. It makes no sense for us both to be cooking separate meals." She hesitated. "I should warn you, though, I am a much better horse trainer than I am a cook." "I have been eating trail food for 12 years, Caleb said, a small smile touching his lips. "I guarantee your cooking is better than that." Dinner was a simple affair, just salt pork fried up with potatoes, a side of beans, and coffee that was strong enough to peel paint off a wall. They ate at the kitchen table, the very same table where her family had shared thousands of meals. Eliza tried her best not to dwell on how strange it was to see a new person sitting there in her father's chair. "This is good," Caleb said, and he sounded like he truly meant it. "You are just being polite." "No, I am being honest. You ought to taste my cooking sometime. Then you would understand the difference." They settled into an easy talk about the plans for the next day, what jobs were the most important, and how they could best split up the work. It was all businesslike and practical, which somehow made things easier than trying to talk about anything personal. After they ate, Caleb stood up to help with the dishes, even though Eliza told him not to bother. "If we are partners, we share the work," he said simply. "All of it." "Even the women's work?" Eliza asked with a bit of sass in her voice. "Especially that. I have been doing my own cooking and washing up for more than 10 years. I do not see why that should suddenly be somebody else's problem, just because there is a woman around." In that single moment, Eliza found herself liking him more than she had the entire time since he first rode up. As night fell, Caleb gathered his bedroll from his horse and started walking toward the barn. "There are extra blankets in the house," Eliza called out to him. "If you need them, I will be just fine. Sleep well, Miss Hartley." "Eliza," she said, the word coming out before she could stop it. "If we are going to be partners, you ought to call me Eliza." He turned back, just a dark shape against the last of the evening light. "Then you had better call me Caleb. Partners do not need to be so formal." "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Eliza." She watched until he vanished inside the barn. Then she went back into the house and slid the bolt on the door, a new habit she had picked up since that business with the foreclosure. The house felt more empty than usual, but at the same time, it felt more alive. For the first time in what felt like forever, the air held the promise of a future, instead of just the weight of dread. The next 3 days set a routine that felt both strange and right. They worked from the moment the sun came up until it went down. Caleb got to work on the fence repairs while Eliza took care of the horses and all the other little chores that keep a ranch from falling apart. They ate their meals together, talking over their plans and problems, and slowly they started to learn how the other one worked and what made them tick. Caleb, as Eliza soon found out, was steady and patient. He was the kind of man who did a job right the first time, even if it took him a little longer. He was not much of a talker when he was working, but when he did have something to say, it was always thought out and helpful. He had a dry sense of humor. That would catch her by surprise, making sharp little comments that made her laugh when she was least expecting it. For his part, Caleb seemed to respect that Eliza knew what she was doing and did not need him looking over her shoulder or telling her what to do. One time she caught him watching her as she worked with the horses. He had a look on his face that seemed a whole lot like respect as she calmed a jumpy mare down with nothing more than her patience and a soft voice. On the 3rd day, they rode back into town to sign the partnership agreement. Attorney Peaton had everything ready for them. There were 2 copies of a detailed partnership contract that spelled out every last part of their deal. Eliza read through her copy twice, her heart thumping in her chest as the weight of it all settled on her. This was it. This was the moment she stopped being the only owner of her father's ranch and became one half of something new. "Any questions before you sign?" Mr. Peaton asked. Eliza looked over at Caleb. He met her gaze without flinching, his face perfectly calm. "No questions," she said. They both signed their names. Mr. Peaton added his signature as a witness. The partnership was official. Walking out of that office felt like walking into a whole new life. The same sun was shining on the same dusty old street, but everything felt different. "How do you feel?" Caleb asked, as they got back on the wagon. "Scared to death," Eliza confessed, "but also relieved and hopeful. All of it at the same time." "That sounds about right," Caleb agreed. "I would be worried if you were not at least a little bit scared. It means you understand what a big thing we are taking on." As they drove away from town, Eliza saw Vernon Hastings standing in front of the bank. He was watching them with a look on his face she could not quite make out. She lifted her chin high and stared right back at him. He had tried to take everything she had. Now, she was riding away with a partner by her side and a real future ahead of her. Let him chew on that for a while. Back at the ranch, they marked the occasion with a dinner that was a little nicer than usual. Eliza had spent a little extra on a chicken in town, and she roasted it with some wild herbs she had picked from the hills. It almost felt like a celebration, though neither one of them said so out loud. After dinner, Caleb unrolled a rough drawing on the table. "I have been thinking about that room addition," he said. "If we build it off the east side of the house, we can use the wall that is already there for support and tie it right into the existing roof. It will not be anything fancy, but it will be solid and it will be warm." Eliza looked over the drawing. "When would you get started?" "Tomorrow, if the weather stays clear. I can work on it in the evenings after I'm done with the fence repairs for the day." "That is an awful lot of work. Work is what I'm here for." Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch began to change. The fence line got new posts that stood up straight and strong. The roof on the barn got patched. The pump for the well was fixed. And slowly, one board at a time, Caleb built himself a room on the side of the house. Eliza helped out whenever she could. She held boards steady for him while he hammered, brought him tools, and mixed the mortar for the little stove he put in. She saw that he worked with the same quiet skill he applied to everything else, never rushing his work, but never wasting a single motion either. They fell into a daily life that felt both personal and carefully separated. Caleb was always up first in the morning. He would get the coffee started and see to his horse before Eliza even came downstairs. She cooked breakfast while he laid out the work for the day. They would talk about what needed doing over their coffee. Then they would go their separate ways to work on their own tasks, meeting back at the house around noon for a quick lunch and to see how things were going. The gossips back in town started to lose interest when nothing juicy seemed to be happening. A few folks even started to treat their partnership like a real business arrangement, like the ranchers who would stop by to look at her horses, or the merchants who started dealing with Caleb like a proper partner instead of some stranger. One afternoon in early November, a crusty old cattleman by the name of Jack Morrison rode up wanting to see the horses. He had known Eliza's father and had always been a straight shooter in his dealings. "Heard you took on a partner," Morrison said to Eliza. "Folks in town had a lot to say about that." "I'm sure they did," Eliza replied, her voice steady. Morrison looked over at Caleb, who was busy strengthening a corral fence not too far away. "Is that him?" "That is Caleb Mercer. Would you like me to introduce you?" "No need. I met him about 6 years ago. He was working a cattle drive up through Colorado. A good man from what I remember. An honest man to do business with." Morrison gave a little nod like he approved. "You could have done a lot worse." That was the closest thing to a blessing Eliza had gotten from anyone in town, and it meant more to her than she would have guessed. As November wore on and the days got shorter, the ranch started to feel less like a heavy weight Eliza was trying to carry all by herself and more like a real working operation. The pregnant mares were beginning to show, their bellies getting round with the promise of new foals. Caleb had his room addition almost done, and the two of them had found a way of working together that was built on respect for each other and a companionship that felt surprisingly easy. One evening, they were sitting on the porch together, watching the sun go down behind the hills, when Caleb spoke up. "I need to go to Colorado." Eliza's stomach did a flip. "When?" "Real soon, before the cold truly settles in. I have got to get things squared away with the cattle company, figure out what to do with the herd, and bring back a few bulls if we want to start our own breeding program. How long do you expect to be gone? 3 weeks? Maybe a month? It all depends on the weather and how many head of cattle I figure on pushing back this way." A month. Just the thought of running this ranch by herself again, even for a short while, sent a wave of pure panic right through Eliza. She had grown accustomed to his help, to having a partner. The notion of going back to struggling alone, even for a little bit, felt harder than she could have imagined. "The mares," she said, "they are due in December." "If anything goes wrong, I will be back long before then," Caleb promised her. "I'm thinking of leaving in a couple of days. That will have me back by the middle of December, at the latest. It gives us a little room before the foals arrive. What if you get held up? What if a blizzard hits? Or Eliza?" Caleb's voice was soft but firm. "I am not walking out on this partnership. I am going to take care of business we need to handle so we can move ahead. You ran this ranch all by yourself for months before I ever came along. You can manage for a few weeks. That was not the same. I did not have any other choice back then. And you do not have one now. This trip has to happen." He took a breath. "Unless you do not trust me to come on back." Eliza looked at him, a little stung. "That is not it. I trust you. I just—" She fumbled for the right words to explain her fear. "I am not used to leaning on somebody. And now that I am, the idea of being on my own again just feels so much harder than it did before." "That is what a partnership is," Caleb said, real quiet. "Y'all are stronger together, which just means you feel it more when one of you ain't there. That does not mean we should not do it. It just means it is important." He was right, and Eliza knew it deep down. She gave him a slow nod. "I am going to need you to take care of the fencing while I'm away," Caleb went on, getting back to business. "And there's a patch on the barn roof that has got to be fixed before the first snow. I will write everything down for you, real clear. Detailed notes? You think I cannot remember what you tell me? I think you will have plenty on your plate without trying to recall if I said the northwest or the northeast corner needed a new brace. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of getting ready." Caleb put the finishing touches on the new room, a simple but solid space with a cot, a little stove, a chair, and some pegs on the wall for his clothes. He brought his few belongings inside, and right away the house felt different. It felt lived in, more like a shared home and less like a place he was just passing through. He wrote out pages of directions for the ranch upkeep, laid out the tools so she could find everything easily, and made Eliza walk through a few repairs she might have to do while he was gone. She put up with all his fussing because she knew it came from a good place. He was not looking down on her, he was just worried. The night before he left, they shared a quiet supper. Eliza had cooked a stew thick with meat and vegetables from her garden. It was the kind of meal that sticks to your ribs and gets a man through a long ride. "I will send a message when I get to Colorado," Caleb told her. "And another one before I head back. If you need a thing, if there is any kind of trouble, you can send a wire to the cattle company. They will find me." "I will be just fine," Eliza said, sounding more sure of herself than she felt. "I know you will. But there is no shame in asking for help if you need it. That is what a partnership means, knowing you do not have to carry the whole load by yourself." After they ate, Caleb went out to see to his horse one last time, making sure the gelding was set for the long ride ahead. Eliza stood out on the porch, a shawl pulled tight around her against the chill of the November air, and just watched him. He moved around that barn like he already owned the place, with a comfortable ease that spoke of long years doing such work. 2 months ago, he was a complete stranger. Now he was her partner, and she was handing him half of everything she had in the world. But it was more than that. She was trusting him to ride away and then ride back again. When he came back to the house with his saddlebags packed and ready for the morning, Eliza was still standing right there on the porch. "You ought to get some rest," he said. I will be gone before the sun is up. I just wanted to say, Eliza started, trying to find the right words. Thank you for all of it. For clearing the debt, for this partnership, for building a room instead of staying in the barn, for treating all of this like it is important. It surely does matter, Caleb said, plain as day. This ranch, us working together, it is the bedrock of what I have been aiming for. Of course it matters. Still, she said, thank you. He just nodded and tipped the brim of his hat, a little gesture she had come to know as his way of saying goodbye, and then he went into his new room. Eliza went to her own bed, but it took a long while for sleep to find her. She just laid there awake, listening to the house groaning and settling for the night, the wind whistling through the eaves, and on the other side of her wall, the quiet sounds of another person in the house that had been only hers for so long. Tomorrow, Caleb would be gone, and she would be by herself again, running the ranch, watching the horizon for his return, and praying her faith in him was not a mistake, but for tonight, in that one night, in moment she was not alone, and that, she was starting to learn, made all the difference in the world. That sound of hoofbeats getting fainter and fainter in the dark before sunrise was the lonesomest thing Eliza had ever heard in her life. She stood there on the porch, her coffee growing cold in her hands, and she watched until the dust Caleb's horse kicked up had settled back down on the earth. And then she was all alone with 3 weeks of chores ahead of her. 2 mares heavy with foal, and a little seed of doubt that maybe she had trusted a man too fast, believed too much in a stranger who talked about partnership but might just ride off into Colorado and never look back. She gave her head a little shake, trying to knock that thought loose. Caleb had put his name on legal papers. He had built a room right onto her house. He had put his own money down right alongside hers. A man does not do things like that if he is planning to just up and vanish. Even so, the ranch felt bigger and emptier than it had before he ever showed up, like his being there had taken up more room than she had ever realized. So Eliza just poured everything she had into the work. The fence line Caleb had been working on had to be finished. That spot on the barn roof he had pointed out needed patching before the winter storms came rolling in. The horses needed their daily care, and the pregnant mares needed a little extra watching as they got bigger and moved a little slower each day. There was firewood that needed splitting, water that needed hauling, and 100 little things that had been put off for a day when she had more time or more energy. At the end of that first day on her own, Eliza's hands were raw with blisters and her back was one solid ache. She fixed herself a simple supper of beans and cornbread, and ate it standing right there by the stove because the thought of sitting at that big empty table was just too sad to bear. She tumbled into bed so bone-tired she did not even have the strength to worry. The second day brought a sharp wind down from the north, the kind that had the smell of snow in it, even though the sky above stayed clear and unhelpful. Eliza was up on the barn roof holding a hammer and nails in her half-frozen hands. She tried to recall every detail Caleb had taught her about how to correctly lay down the shingles. She was about halfway done when she noticed one of the pregnant mares was starting to act strangely. Eliza climbed down the ladder so quickly that she almost lost her footing, her heart starting to race. The mare, a bay horse named Sage, was kicking at the dirt and walking in anxious circles. Her sides were dark with sweat, even though the air was cold. "Easy now, girl," Eliza said softly as she slowly walked closer. "It is all right." But Sage's eyes were showing too much white, and she was breathing in rough, loud bursts. This was not normal. The foal was not supposed to arrive for at least another 6 weeks. If the horse was going into labor this early, Eliza knew she was in trouble. Her knowledge of horse births was good but not complete. Her father had always taken the lead during difficult deliveries, with Eliza helping him. She had seen problems before and knew the warning signs, but she had never had to handle a birth this premature all by herself. She guided Sage into a clean stall that was deeply bedded with fresh straw and checked her over. The mare's water had not yet broken, but the contractions were easy to see, her entire body tightening with each one. "It is too soon. This is happening way too soon." "Come on, Sage," Eliza whispered, stroking the mare's damp neck. "You have to hold on. Just hold on a little longer." For 3 hours, Eliza did not leave the horse's side. She watched every contraction, listened to every change in breathing, and was prepared to step in if the birth actually started. She said every prayer she could remember, and even made up a few new ones. Then, like a miracle, the contractions started to come further apart, getting weaker instead of stronger. Her breathing finally settled down. The scare, whatever brought it on, was over. By the time Eliza made it back to the house, the moon was high and it was well past midnight. She fell onto the bed without even taking off her work clothes, too wrung out to think about being proper or comfortable. The next morning, Sage seemed to be doing better, but Eliza kept a close eye on her all day. There were no more contractions and no other signs of trouble. The mare had pulled through, but the whole thing had left Eliza shaken right down to her bones. What if the contractions had kept going? What if that foal had decided to come early and needed special care? What if it was a breech birth, or there was hemorrhaging, or any of the other dozen things that can go wrong out here? She would have been all alone, making life-or-death calls with nobody to turn to, not even a second pair of hands to help. That night, she sat at the kitchen table, Caleb's detailed notes spread out before her, and for the first time since he had gone, she just let herself cry. It was not really from sadness, but from the crushing weight of it all, the deep-down exhaustion of doing every single thing by herself, and the fear of messing up when messing up could mean losing an animal, or worse. She cried for her daddy, who always made this life look so easy, for her mama, who never once complained about being so far from everything and how hard it was, and for herself, for trying to be strong enough to hold up a legacy that felt way too heavy for just one person. The tears did not fix a single thing, but they sure did help. She washed her face, put on a pot of coffee, and got back to work. About a week after Caleb left, a telegram showed up from Colorado. The fellow from the telegraph office brought it out himself, clearly itching for some gossip. But he left disappointed when Eliza read it without a word and sent him on his way. The message was short, arrived safe. Herd healthy, weather holding, will right. CM. Eliza read it over 3 times. She was relieved to know he had made it all the way to Colorado, but frustrated by how little those few lines really told her. Will right. But when? And with what news? The letter he promised showed up 5 days later. It was longer than the telegram, but still just as straight to the point as Caleb himself. He had found the herd in good shape. He was haggling with the foreman of the other outfits about which cows to sell and which ones to drive back home. The weather had turned cold, but the skies were still clear. He figured he would start the journey back within a week. How are the mares, he had written. Any signs of the foal coming early? Make sure Sage stays calm and keeps eating good. Watch for any swelling in her legs. That can be a sign of trouble. And do not try to finish that barn roof by yourself if the weather turns sour. It can wait till I get back. You are worth more than a few shingles. That last sentence made Eliza's throat feel tight. She folded the letter up real careful and put it away in her father's desk. Then she went out to check on Sage, who sure enough had some swelling in her back legs. Eliza spent the whole rest of the day digging through her father's old veterinarian books for remedies, mixing up poultices and wrapping the mare's legs in clean bandages. By morning, the swelling had gone down. The days started to run together. It was just work, worry, a few small wins, and a lot of little setbacks. The air got colder. The first snow came. Just light dustings that were gone by afternoon, but they were a promise of bigger storms on their way. Eliza finished mending the fence line, patched up the barn roof as best she could, and got the ranch ready for winter's arrival. She also started to realize just how much Caleb had been doing that she had never really noticed before. The firewood did not chop itself. The water did not haul itself up from the well. The tools did not get cleaned and put away on their own. All the little chores that somehow got done when 2 people shared the load were now piling up, needing time she just did not have. By the 3rd week, Eliza was running on nothing but pure grit and coffee. She had lost weight she could not spare, and the dark circles under her eyes were there to stay. But the ranch was still standing. The horses were healthy, and she had proven to herself that she could manage on her own if she had to. She just really, really hoped she would not have to. On the 22nd day Caleb was gone, Eliza was in the barn doctoring a small cut on one of the geldings when she heard the sound of hoofbeats and the lowing of cattle. Her heart just about jumped out of her chest. She dropped the medicine tin and ran outside. 3 riders were coming up the road, pushing a small herd of about 30 cattle ahead of them, moving at that slow, tired pace of animals that had been on the trail for a long time. And leading them all, sitting tall in his saddle, even though you could see how tired he was Caleb Mercer. Eliza felt so relieved it made her head spin. She had to grab the barn door to hold herself steady, just watching as the riders guided the cattle into the west pasture. Caleb swung down off his horse, said something to the other 2 men, and then turned toward the house. His eyes found her right away, and even from that far off she could see his face change, worry taking the place of his weariness. He crossed the yard between them in a few long strides. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "No, I am fine. Eliza realized she was shaking. "I am fine. You are back. 3 days early. We made better time than I figured." Caleb's eyes were searching her face, taking in the lost weight, the exhaustion, all the signs of someone who had been pushing way too hard for way too long. "Have you been eating?" "Yes, mostly, when I remember to." "The mares are fine," Eliza said, jumping in before he could ask. "Sage had some contractions about 2 weeks back, but they stopped. I have been watching her like a hawk. Her legs swelled up some, but I treated it and it is mostly gone. Everything is fine." Caleb looked like he wanted to argue about that, but one of the other riders called out to him. "Mercer, we got these cattle settled. You need us to stick around and help with anything else?" "No, Tom. You and Davis go on into town. Get yourselves a hot meal and a soft bed. I will settle up with you all tomorrow." The 2 riders tipped their hats and headed off, both of them too worn out to care about much besides sleep. Caleb turned back to Eliza. "Come on, you need to sit down before you fall down." "I am not going to fall down, just humor me." He put a hand on her elbow and guided her toward the house, and Eliza was too tired to even think about putting up a fight. Inside, he sat her down at the kitchen table and went right to work building up the fire in the stove. "When was the last time you ate a real meal?" he asked. "I eat real meals." That is not an answer. Eliza had to think hard about yesterday. "I think I had eggs yesterday morning." Caleb muttered something under his breath that did not sound like a compliment. He started rummaging through the pantry, pulling things out, and in just a few minutes he had bacon sizzling in a pan. The smell made Eliza's stomach rumble so loud that Caleb shot her a look that plainly said, "I told you so." While the food cooked, he poured her a cup of coffee, real coffee, strong and hot. He stood there watching her with his arms crossed, like he was worried she might just vanish if he looked away. "I told you to take care of yourself," he said. "I did take care of myself," she shot back. "I just also had to take care of every other blessed thing." "You look like you have not slept in a week." "I sleep," Eliza insisted. "Just not all at once." Caleb just shook his head and turned back to the stove. He piled a plate high with bacon, eggs, and fried potatoes, set it right in front of her, and said, "Eat." Eliza wanted to argue just for the sake of it, but the food smelled too good and she was too darn hungry. She ate, and Caleb cooked up another batch for himself. For a while, the only sounds in the kitchen were the clinking of forks and the comforting crackle of the fire. Finally, Caleb said, "Tell me what happened with Sage." Eliza told him everything about the scare with the early contractions, the long hours she spent watching over the mare, and the swelling in her legs that had come and gone. Caleb listened to the whole story without saying a word, his face getting more and more concerned. "You should have sent me a wire," he said when she was done. "And said what? Come on back because I'm scared?" "You were doing important work. I handled it. Being partners means we handle things together, Eliza. That means the scary parts, too. You were not here, so I handled it alone. People just do that." Caleb stood there quiet for what felt like a long time. I never should have left you by yourself for 3 weeks. That was plain foolish on my part. You had to go, Caleb. We both knew it. I should have planned it better. Hired somebody to help out while I was gone. You know we can't afford to hire help just yet. We can afford that a whole lot better than we can afford you working yourself into an early grave. He gently pushed his empty plate to the side. From here on out, if I have to be gone for more than a couple of days, we're making sure you have help. That's not up for discussion. Eliza wanted to fight him on it, but a deep weariness was settling in her bones now that the excitement of his return was wearing off. Fine. Did you get the bulls? 3 of them. They're young, got good bloodlines, and their genetics are different enough to build a solid breeding program. They're out with the herd in the Aoyo pasture. He took a breath. I also brought back a few of my own. Had to sell the rest to the outfit, but I held on to my best breeding cows. Figured it'd be a good place for us to build from. How many head is that altogether? 32 cattle and the 3 bulls. It's not a huge spread, but it's a start. Eliza did the numbers in her head. If they managed things right, they could double that herd in 2 years. In 5, they could have a cattle operation that was truly making money. Between that and the horse breeding, the ranch might actually do more than just scrape by. That's good, she said quietly. That's real good. Caleb was looking at her again with that worried set to his jaw. When was the last time you got a full night of sleep? What do you call full? More than 4 hours. Eliza thought about telling a fib, but what was the use? I can't remember. Right. You're going to bed. Right now. But it's barely even dark, and you're dead on your feet. Go on and get some sleep. I'll take care of the evening chores. You just drove a herd all the way from Colorado, and you've been running this whole ranch by yourself for 3 weeks. I'm tired. You're exhausted. There is a big difference. When Eliza still didn't budge, he softened his voice. Please, Eliza, just let me handle things for one night. You've earned it more than enough. The simple kindness in his voice was what finally broke her. Eliza just nodded, too worn out to argue anymore, and made her way upstairs. She was planning to change into a nightgown, wash the dust from her face, and do all the things a person does before bed. Instead, she sat on the edge of the mattress to pull off her boots and woke up 10 hours later. She was still in her work clothes, with a heavy quilt draped over her that she knew she hadn't put there. Morning light was pouring through the window. Eliza sat up, confused for a second, then realized Caleb must have looked in on her during the night. The idea ought to have felt like an intrusion, but instead, it just felt like he was taking care of her. She got changed proper, washed up, and went downstairs. The smell of breakfast was already in the air, but Caleb was gone, likely out tending to the stock. A note sat on the table, written in his blocky hand. Stay inside. Rest. We will handle all the chores today. This is not a request. A small smile touched Eliza's lips. She ignored the note, of course, and headed out to help. But she moved at a slower, more careful pace than she had in weeks. When Caleb gave her a frustrated look from across the barn, she just shrugged. Partners share the work, remember? You said that yourself. I meant when you're not half dead from being tired. I'm not half dead. I'm maybe a quarter dead. That's completely different. You are an impossible woman. You're the one who chose me for a partner. Something in Caleb's face seemed to soften. Yeah, I sure did. They spent the morning working, easily falling back into the old rhythm they'd found before he left. It was amazing how natural it felt so quickly. The way they moved without talking. How the tasks just divided themselves. The simple comfort of working alongside someone. By the afternoon, Eliza was starting to feel like her old self again. They walked out to the Aoyo pasture to look over the new cattle, and Eliza had to admit Caleb had a good eye. The animals looked strong and healthy with the stocky frames they'd need to survive in this rugged country. They'll do, she said, which was about the highest praise she ever gave. And he knew it. The bulls should be able to service the mares just as well as the cows if it comes to it, Caleb mentioned. Though I reckon you'll want Ranger to do most of that work, of course, but it's always good to have other options. They stood there for a while just watching the cattle graze. The winter sun was low and weak, but it was there, and the wind was cold but didn't have a mean bite to it. It was one of those quiet, perfect moments on the ranch. Everything was peaceful. Everything was just as it should be. Then Caleb spoke. "I need to tell you something." Eliza's stomach clenched up. She knew it. Here came the bad news he'd been holding back. "What is it?" "While I was up in Colorado, I had a lot of time to think about this partnership, about our whole arrangement and how it's all been going." He paused like he was picking his words with great care. "This is working, Eliza. To be honest, it's working out better than I ever figured it would. You're a good partner. You're fair, you're capable, and you're willing to pull your own weight and then some. Maybe a little too willing, judging by these last 3 weeks. Is there a but coming? No, no but. I'm just telling you that I'm in this for the long haul, no matter what happens, no matter how hard things get. I am committed to making this partnership a success. I just wanted to make sure you knew that." A wave of relief washed over Eliza, so powerful it almost made her knees weak. She had been steeling herself for him to say he was having second thoughts. That 3 weeks away had made him realize this whole thing was a mistake. But instead, he was digging his heels in deeper. "I'm committed too," she said. "Even when you drive me crazy, insisting on doing everything the proper way instead of the fast way. And even when you work yourself into the ground trying to prove you don't need any help. Even then." They started walking back toward the house, side by side, through the grass that was already turning brown for the winter. Eliza caught herself thinking how different her life was now compared to just 3 months ago. The foreclosure notice, the mountain of debt, the crushing feeling of trying to save her daddy's ranch all by herself. It all felt like it had happened to someone else in another lifetime. That evening, they sat down for a real dinner at the kitchen table. Caleb must have been missing real food on his trip because he had put in some serious effort. He'd cooked steak from the cattle he brought back, potatoes roasted with wild onions, and even a pie made with dried apples. The whole meal felt like a celebration. "This is mighty fancy," Eliza remarked. 3 weeks of trail food will make a man appreciate a real kitchen. I thought you said my cooking was good." "It is, but you don't make pie. That's a fair point." After dinner, they sat out on the porch, wrapped in heavy coats against the cold, and watched the stars start to pop out in the dark sky. Caleb had made coffee, and the warmth from the mug felt good in Eliza's hands. "The mares," Caleb said. "How close do you reckon they are?" "Sage could go any day now. She's dropped. You can see how the shape of her belly has changed. The other one, Willow, she probably has another week or 2. We should probably set up a watch schedule. Make sure someone is checking on them every few hours during the night. I was already planning on sleeping out in the barn once Sage started looking real close. Then we both will. We can take shifts. That way we both get some sleep. But the horses are never left alone." The easy, natural way he said "we" still sent a little jolt through Eliza. She had been on her own for so long that having someone else just automatically include himself in her plans felt like a precious gift she never even knew she was missing. "Caleb," she said, the word tumbling out before she could stop it. "Thank you for coming back, for bringing the cattle, for—" She waved a hand, not quite able to put words to all of it. "For everything." He looked over at her, his eyes serious in the starlight. "You don't ever have to thank me for keeping my word, Eliza. That's just being a decent human being." "Still, a lot of men wouldn't have." "Then you've been knowing the wrong kind of men." Maybe she had. Or maybe she just never had the chance to know a man like Caleb Mercer. A man who said what he meant and did what he said. Who believed a partnership was something sacred, not just something convenient. Who looked at her like an equal, not like some woman who needed to be told what to do. That night, Eliza slept deep and dreamless in her own bed, knowing that downstairs in his room, Caleb was doing the same. The house felt whole again, in a way it hadn't since her folks had passed. It wasn't because a man was living there. It was because the house was no longer a place built just for being lonely. The next morning, the first real snow of the season began to fall. Big, heavy flakes came down thick and fast, blanketing the whole ranch in white. Caleb and Eliza worked side by side to make sure all the animals were under shelter with extra feed. that the water troughs wouldn't ice over, and that the firewood was stacked up close to the house. By the middle of the morning, the snow was coming down so hard they could barely make out the barn from the kitchen window. "This is going to be a bad one," Caleb said, staring out at the white world. "It's a good thing you got back when you did. One more day and you'd have been caught right in the middle of it. One more day and I would have been worried sick thinking about you being stuck in it all alone." They spent the rest of the day inside, taking care of indoor chores. They mended tack, organized supplies, and went over the account books together. Caleb laid out the financial records from the cattle sale, showing her how he had negotiated the prices and what he had spent on supplies for the trip back. "Didn't take you for a numbers man," Eliza remarked. "Trail bosses have to be. You're managing payroll, supply costs, road expenses, and sale prices at the end of the line. You learn to be good with math, or you go broke real fast." Eliza, in turn, showed him her breeding records, the detailed journals her father had started and she had faithfully continued. Caleb asked smart questions about bloodlines and genetics, which proved he knew a lot more about selective breeding than he had first let on. They worked well together, Eliza realized. They had different strengths and different areas of knowledge, but their values and their approach to work were the same. It was a good, solid foundation for a partnership. That night, the storm was still howling outside. They ate their dinner by the light of a lamp as snow piled up against the windows, and the wind moaned around the corners of the house. After they cleaned up, they sat by the fire. Caleb was in the old, worn armchair that had been her father's. Eliza was on the sofa with a blanket over her lap. "Tell me about your family," Eliza said softly. "You mentioned your mother's farm. What happened to it?" Caleb was quiet for such a long time she thought he was not going to answer. Finally, he spoke. "My daddy died when I was 16. A horse kicked him in the head, just one of those awful things. My mother, she tried to keep the farm going, but she did not know a thing about the money side of it. My daddy had always taken care of all that. Before a year was out, she was behind on debts she never even knew they had. The bank foreclosed. We lost every last thing. I am so sorry. She passed on 2 years later. I think she just gave up. She could not stand living in town after losing the land. I was 18 years old, all on my own, with nothing but what I could carry, and a fire in my belly to never, ever be that helpless again. So you started saving every single dollar for 12 years. Figured if I ever got another chance at a piece of land, I would make damn sure nobody could ever take it away from me." He looked right at her then. "That is why I could not just watch it happen to you. I could not stand by and let that bank take everything you had when I had the money to stop it." Eliza finally understood him a little better. All the careful saving, his dedication to their partnership, the fierce way he protected what they were building. He was not just buying into some land, he was trying to give his own mother's story a different ending. "We are not going to lose this ranch," she said, her voice firm. "Not either one of us. We are going to build it into something that will last." "I believe that," Caleb said. "I truly do." The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the storm howled, but in that little kitchen, in that moment, everything felt safe and sound. 3 days later, the storm finally wore itself out, leaving the ranch buried under 2 feet of snow. They dug themselves out and checked on all the animals and saw that everything had made it through. The expectant mares were a little skittish but seemed healthy. Caleb laid out the watch schedule he had talked about. They began taking shifts, checking on Sage every 3 hours, day and night, watching for any sign that her time was near. Eliza showed him what to look for: the nervous pacing, the pawing at the ground, and the way a mare's belly would draw up tight with contractions. On the 5th night after he got back, Sage started her labor. Eliza was on watch, making her midnight rounds, when she discovered the mare in clear trouble. She hurried to wake Caleb, and they stood by together as the birth began. It was a hard one. The foal was turned wrong. One of its legs was bent back instead of pointing forward with the other. In that position, there was no safe way for it to be born. "I've got to reach in there and move it," Eliza said, her voice strained with fear. "If I can't get it turned, we're going to lose them both." "Just tell me what to do," Caleb said with a steady voice. How can I help? His calmness gave her strength. They went to work as a team. Eliza carefully slid her arm into the birth canal to guide the foal's leg forward, while Caleb held Sage's head, whispering to her and keeping the mare from giving in to panic. It was 20 minutes of pure agony. Eliza's arm was deep inside the laboring horse, her fingers searching for the little hoof that she needed to fix. At long last, she felt it slide into place. "Got it," she breathed out. "Both legs are forward now. She ought to be able to push." And Sage pushed with all her might until a wet, long-legged foal tumbled out into the straw. It was a filly, perfect and complete, already trying to push her head up. Eliza leaned back on her heels, shaking from relief and being so tired. Caleb was still by, Sage's head grinning like a fool. "We did it," he said. "Yes, we did," Eliza agreed. They stayed right there in the barn until the foal was up on its feet and nursing, a sure sign she was healthy even after such a tough delivery. Sage licked her new baby clean with a look of pure pride, already a doting mother. As they walked back to the house in the cold air just before dawn, Eliza noticed her hands were still trembling. Caleb saw it too, and wrapped his arm around her shoulders for just a second, a quiet moment of comfort between two partners who had just been through something heavy. "You were really something in there," he told her. "I was scared to death." Being scared and doing it anyway, well, that's what being something looks like. Back inside, Caleb put on a pot of coffee while Eliza cleaned herself up. They sat down at the kitchen table, too keyed up to even think about sleeping. "I could not have done that by myself," Eliza confessed. "If you had not been here, if you were still out in Colorado, I do not know if I could have stayed calm enough to turn that foal." "But I was here," Caleb replied. "That is what a partnership is all about. When things get hard, when they get scary, you are not out there on your own." "I spent so many years believing I had to handle everything myself," Eliza said in a low voice. "Thinking that asking for help was a weakness, that relying on anyone was just asking for trouble. And now? Now I am starting to see the difference between depending on someone and having a partner, between being weak and being wise." She looked him in the eye. "You have taught me that, whether you meant to or not." A change came over Caleb's face. It might have been warmth, or maybe he recognized the trust she was giving him. "You have taught me a few things, too. About sticking to a dream. About not quitting when the work gets hard. About what it means to love something so much you would break your own heart trying to save it." They sat in the quiet of the kitchen as the sun started to rise outside. They were just two people who had been strangers 4 months ago, but now they were tied together by contracts and cattle, and a perfect little filly sleeping in the barn. Eliza knew with a sudden and complete certainty that this partnership was the finest choice she had ever made, not just for the ranch but for herself. Whatever was coming their way, and she had a feeling it would be a lot, both good and bad, they were going to face it side by side. And that, right there, changed everything. They named the filly Starlight, on account of the white mark that ran down her face like a beam of moonlight. She did well in her first few weeks, getting stronger by the day, and Eliza would spend hours just watching her learn about the world on those impossibly long legs. But the happiness of new life was dimmed by the worry over Willow, the other pregnant mare. She was getting heavier, but she was not showing any of the usual signs that labor was coming soon. "She should have dropped by now," Eliza said one morning in the middle of December, smoothing her hand over Willow's stretched-out belly. The mare was not comfortable, always shifting her weight, but nothing was moving along like it should. Caleb frowned, looking the horse over with a careful eye. "How late is she?" "Almost 2 weeks, maybe even longer. The breeding dates were not exact." Eliza's voice was tight with worry. "I have never had a mare go this far past her time. Something is not right." They watched her even closer, checking on Willow every 2 hours, all day and all night. Caleb took the night shifts without a word of complaint because he knew Eliza was already worn thin with worry. The winter had come in hard, dumping snow faster than they could move it, and the daily chore of keeping the ranch going in the bitter cold had left them both bone-tired. 3 days before Christmas, Caleb walked back to the house at sunrise with a hard look on his face. "She is down," he said, "and she cannot get up." Eliza's heart just sank. She grabbed her coat and took off for the barn, with Caleb right on her heels. Willow was lying in her stall, her sides heaving and her eyes rolling with pain. When Eliza tried to coax her to her feet, the mare could barely move. "How long has she been like this?" Eliza asked, already checking the horse over. "Found her this way 20 minutes ago. She was on her feet at the midnight check." Eliza's hands moved across Willow's belly, trying to feel the foal's position, looking for any hint that labor was starting. What she felt turned her blood to ice. The foal was completely sideways, not just a leg out of place. It was an impossible position for a natural birth. "We need a veterinarian," she said, struggling to keep her voice from shaking. "Right now." "The closest vet is over in Socorro. That is 3 hours on a good day, and we have got 2 feet of fresh snow out there." "Then you had better ride hard. I will stay with her." Caleb did not waste a second arguing. He saddled up his horse and rode out into the dark of the early morning. Eliza stayed behind with Willow, doing everything she knew how to do to keep the mare comfortable, just trying to buy some time until help could get there. But time was the one thing they did not have. 2 hours crawled by. Willow was getting worse, fast. Her breathing got shallow. Her body temperature started to fall. And no matter what Eliza did, the mare was slipping away. Eliza had helped deliver difficult foals before. She had helped her father with emergencies, but this was more than she could handle. The foal was too big, turned too wrong, and Willow was just too weak to make it through the kind of operation that might save the baby. Eliza sat down in the straw next to the dying mare with tears running down her cheeks, and she made the toughest decision of her whole life. She could not save them both. The foal was probably already gone, stuck in a way that had likely cut off its air hours ago. But Willow, if Eliza acted right then, if she quit trying to save the foal and just focused on keeping the mare alive, there was a small chance. With hands that shook, she did what had to be done. The whole thing was awful and heartbreaking, and when it was all over, Eliza was covered in blood and crying her eyes out. But Willow was breathing easier, the terrible weight finally gone from her body. The foal, a colt that was perfectly formed, had been gone for hours. Caleb got back with the veterinarian to find Eliza sitting against the stall wall. The dead foal was wrapped in a canvas beside her, and Willow was standing on wobbly legs, but she was alive. Dr. Harrison took one look at the scene and knew right away what had happened. He gave Willow a thorough checkup, gave her some medicine to stop any infection, and then he finally turned to Eliza. "You did the right thing," he told her quietly. "The foal was already lost. You saved the mare's life." "I know," Eliza whispered. "That does not make it any easier." After the vet drove off, Caleb buried the colt in the frozen earth while Eliza stayed with Willow. It took him 3 hours of back-breaking work, with the ground fighting the shovel every inch of the way. But he did it because it had to be done, and because Eliza needed to know the foal was laid to rest the right way. When he got back to the barn, Eliza was still there, sitting in the straw, and just staring off into space. "Come on inside," Caleb said, his voice soft. "You are frozen clean through." "I should have known something was wrong sooner. I should have called the vet days ago." "You did everything you possibly could. Sometimes everything is not enough. My father never lost a foal, not in 30 years of breeding." "Your father had 30 years of experience. You have got 3. And you made a choice that saved Willow's life. That counts for something." Eliza let him help her up and walk her back to the house. She felt numb, just going through the motions of washing up and putting on clean clothes without really thinking about it. When she came back downstairs, Caleb had soup warming on the stove and a fresh pot of strong coffee brewed. "Eat," he said, and the way he said it, there was no arguing. She ate because he told her to, but she could not taste a thing. Her mind kept playing back every single moment of the last week, trying to figure out what she had missed, what she could have done in a different way. "Stop it," Caleb said, watching her. "Stop what?" "Blaming yourself. I can see you doing it. You are going over every decision, every choice, looking for where you messed up. Do not do that." "How can I not? That foal died because sometimes things just go wrong. Because nature is not always gentle or fair. Because even when you do everything right, you can still lose." He leaned forward, his eyes serious. "You want to know what I see? I see somebody who fought for 3 hours in a freezing barn to save what could be saved. Somebody who had to make a choice nobody should have to make and had the strength to see it through. That is not failure, Eliza. That is courage." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to accept that she had truly done her best in a situation with no good answers, but all she could see was that perfect little colt, gone before he ever took a single breath. That night she wept until she fell asleep while a winter wind howled around the ranch house. Sometime in the deepest dark, she woke up and found Caleb sitting in the chair next to her bed. He was keeping watch, just like he had on the night of Sage's long and difficult birth. "What are you doing?" she asked him, her voice scratchy. "Making sure you are all right. I am fine." "No, you are not," he said gently. "But you will be." He waited a moment. "On my first cattle drive, we lost 100 head of cattle trying to cross a river. They stampeded in the water and the animals were drowning. There was nothing any of us could do to stop it. I felt like I had failed, that I was to blame for every single one. The trail boss told me something that day I have never forgotten. He said you can do everything right and still lose. It does not mean you failed. It just means you are dealing with living creatures in a world you cannot predict." "Did that help, him telling you that?" "Not right away," Caleb admitted. "But it did in time." Caleb got to his feet. "Get some rest. Tomorrow is another day with more work to be done." She finally did sleep, and when she woke the next morning, the sadness was still there, but it was not a crushing weight anymore. She could breathe around it. Christmas came and went without much fuss. They worked through the day like any other, but Caleb did surprise her with a small gift. It was a leather journal for her to keep track of the breeding records, a much finer one than she had been using. "For writing down everything," he said, "the successes and the failures. That way you can learn from all of it." "I did not get you anything," Eliza said, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "You gave me a partnership and a piece of land worth building a future on. That is more than enough of a gift." And they ate a better supper than they usually did. Caleb roasted one of the chickens, and Eliza made biscuits that for once turned out just right. It was a simple meal, but it felt important. It was their first holiday spent together, and it marked just how far they had come since that terrible day in October when the bank had arrived to take everything away. As the winter got deeper and meaner, they found their new rhythm. The cattle business needed constant work, like breaking the ice on the water troughs, dragging feed through the heavy snow, and checking on the animals in the brutal, biting cold. The horses required care every single day, and Starlight needed special attention as she continued to grow. Between the two of them, Caleb and Eliza got it all done. But some days the work felt like it would never end, and the cold felt like it was trying to break them both. One especially vicious morning in January, with the temperatures so low that water turned to solid ice just minutes after being poured, Caleb stumbled in from chores. His face was white from the cold, and his hands were shaking so hard he could not hold his coffee cup steady. "That is it," Eliza said with a firm voice. "We are hiring some help. We need at least one extra hand to get us through the rest of this winter." "We can manage. We can barely manage, and it is killing us both. We need help, Caleb. That is not a sign of weakness. That is just being smart." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, and then he nodded. "You are right. I will ask around in town and see if anybody is looking for winter work." 2 days later, a young man by the name of Jesse Colton showed up at their ranch. He was 19 years old, thin as a rail, with eager eyes and calloused hands that told you he was no stranger to hard work. "Heard you might be needing some help," he said, standing in the yard and holding his hat in his hands. "I am good with both cattle and horses. The cold weather does not bother me. I work hard, I do not complain, and I am honest." Eliza glanced over at Caleb, who was sizing up the young man with the sharp eye of someone who had hired his share of trail hands over the years. "You got any references?" Caleb asked. "I worked for the Morrison Ranch last summer. Jack Morrison will speak for me." That was all Caleb needed to hear. Morrison was known for running a good, tight operation and for not putting up with any fools. $1 a day plus your room and board," Caleb said. "You will bunk in the barn and eat your meals with us at the house. You will be expected to work whatever hours we need you. And in the winter, that means most of them." "Yes, sir." "And you will take orders from either of us and treat them the same. This is a partnership operation. Miss Hartley's word is just as good as mine." Jesse looked over at Eliza with a new kind of respect in his eyes. "Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am." Having Jesse around changed absolutely everything. The daily chores became something they could handle again. The three of them were able to take turns with the duties, which made sure that nothing was missed and that no one worked themselves straight into the ground. Jesse turned out to be exactly what he claimed to be. He was hardworking, dependable, and he had a real skill with the livestock. But more than that, his being there shifted the feeling between Eliza and Caleb in ways neither of them had seen coming. With a third person around, even if it was just during work hours, they started to notice their own growing closeness more. They noticed the way they had started to finish each other's sentences, and the small, easy touches that had become a habit between them. It was Caleb's hand on her shoulder when he walked behind her chair, or Eliza straightening his scarf before he headed out into the biting cold. One evening in late January, after Jesse had gone to the barn for the night, Eliza and Caleb were sitting by the fire just as they often did. The silence that settled between them was a comfortable one, but it was filled with an energy that neither of them had yet put a name to. "Can I ask you something?" Eliza finally said, breaking the quiet. "Always. Do you ever think about the future? Not just the ranch, but everything else?" Caleb put down the harness he was fixing. "I think about it all the time. And what do you see?" He was quiet for a good long while. "To be honest, I see this partnership of ours becoming something more. I see us building more than just a successful ranch. I see us building a life together. I see." He paused, like he was second-guessing his own words. "What?" Eliza pushed him, her heart just a hammering. "I see myself asking you to marry me," Caleb said, his voice low. "Not 'cause it's practical or 'cause folks expect it, but because somewhere between this past October and now, I plain fell in love with you." Those words just hung there in the quiet between them, brave and raw and from clean out of nowhere. Eliza couldn't hardly breathe. "Caleb, you don't have to answer now. You don't have to answer at all if that ain't what you want. I'm not trying to change our deal or make things messy. I just had to let you know, 'cause I'm no good at hiding what I feel, and I don't want to spend the rest of this winter pretending I don't love you when I do." Eliza just stared at him, her mind spinning. She should have seen this coming, should have known what was growing between them. But she'd been so focused on the ranch, on just surviving, on proving she could handle this partnership that she'd missed the most important thing of all. She was in love with him too. The feeling hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere between him paying off her debt and building a new room on her house and staying up all night with the mares in labor and making her eat when she forgot. Somewhere in all that, she'd fallen completely and truly in love with Caleb Mercer. "I need time," she heard her own voice say, "to think on this, about what it would all mean." "Take all the time you need," Caleb said, but she could see the letdown in his eyes. "Nothing has to change. We're partners first, always." But everything had already changed. The words were out there now, and Eliza couldn't take them back. She couldn't go back to seeing Caleb as just her business partner when her heart was jumping every time he so much as looked her way. She went to bed that night all torn up inside, her mind racing with what-ifs and fears. Marriage meant tying herself to someone for good, trusting another person with not just her ranch, but her whole life. It meant being vulnerable in ways a partnership never asked for. It meant admitting she needed someone, not just for practical things, but for reasons of the heart. The very idea of it scared her to death, but it also filled her with a kind of hope she hadn't felt since before her parents passed. The hope of building something that would last, of not facing whatever was coming all alone, of loving and being loved back. 3 days later, disaster struck in a way none of them could have ever seen coming. Caleb was working in the Aoyo pasture, checking on the cattle, when his horse spooked at something. A snake, maybe, or just a trick of the light. The gelding reared up, and Caleb, caught by surprise, was thrown hard. He landed all wrong, his leg twisted up under him, and the awful crack of bone breaking echoed across the empty field. Jesse found him 20 minutes later, barely conscious and pale with pain, his leg bent at an angle that turned the young man's stomach. "Get Eliza," Caleb ground out through his teeth. "Don't you move me, just get her." Jesse took off for the house, and Eliza came at a dead run, her medical kit in her hands. One look at Caleb's leg told her all she needed to know. The break was real bad, a compound fracture with bone showing through torn skin. It was the kind of hurt that could cripple a man for life if it wasn't handled right. "We need the doctor," she said, making herself stay calm. "Jesse, you ride for Socorro as fast as that horse can carry you. Tell Dr. Harrison it's an emergency." "That'll take hours," Jesse argued. "In this cold with that injury, we don't have time for arguing. Go." Jesse went, and Eliza was left there alone with Caleb, who was drifting in and out from the shock and the pain. "Don't you dare die on me," she told him, her voice fierce as she worked to brace the leg as best she could with whatever she could find. "You hear me, Caleb Mercer? You don't get to tell me you love me and then die 3 days later. That ain't how this is going to work." Through the fog of his pain, Caleb managed something that might have been a smile. "Wasn't planning on dying. Good. Because I've got things to say to you. And you're going to be awake and clear-headed when I say them." She got him back to the house, a pure nightmare of a trip, with Jesse's help when he got back, and onto his bed. Dr. Harrison showed up 4 hours later, looked over the leg, and gave her the news Eliza had been dreading. "The break is severe. I can set it, but there's no guarantee it'll heal right. Best case scenario, he's looking at months of being laid up. Worst case, the doctor didn't need to finish that sentence. He didn't have to." Eliza stood in the hallway outside Caleb's room while Dr. Harrison worked, listening to the sounds of pain that Caleb couldn't quite hold back, even with the laudanum the doctor had given him. She'd been through a lot in her 23 years, losing her parents, foreclosure, impossible choices, dead foals. But this was different. This was watching someone she loved hurting and being completely powerless to stop it. When Dr. Harrison finally came out, he looked worn down. "The leg is set. I've done all I can. Now it's up to him and to you. He's going to need constant care for the next few weeks. That bone has to heal straight, and that means keeping him still, even when every part of him will want to move. The wound needs cleaning every day to keep infection out, and he needs to keep his strength up, which won't be easy when he's in that much pain." "I can do all of that," Eliza said. "It won't be easy. You're already running a ranch, and now you're going to be a nurse on top of it. I don't care if it's easy. Just tell me what to do." The doctor left her with detailed instructions and enough laudanum to get them through the next week. After he rode off into the growing dark, Eliza stood in the yard and let herself tremble for exactly 1 minute. Then she pulled her shoulders back and went back inside. Caleb was awake, pale and sweating, his leg held still in the splints the doctor had fixed up. "Eliza," he said, his voice weak. "Don't talk. Save your strength. Gotta tell you, the cattle. Jesse can't handle them all by himself. And Willow needs, I'll handle it, all of it. Jesse and I will manage the ranch. You just worry about healing. Partnership means when one of us can't pull their weight, the other one picks up the slack. Right now, that's me. So you're gonna lie there and heal and not worry about a single thing except getting better." Caleb tried to argue, but the pain and being so tired pulled him under before he could get the words out. The next few weeks were the hardest Eliza had ever lived through. She and Jesse split the ranch work between them, taking on Caleb's chores on top of their own. The days started before the sun came up and ended long after it set. In between all that, Eliza took care of Caleb, cleaning his wound, changing his bandages, forcing him to eat when the pain stole his appetite, keeping him still when being restless made him want to move. She slept in little bits, mostly in the chair next to his bed, jerking awake at any little sound that meant he might need her. Jesse really stepped up, working longer hours than he was paid for and never complaining, even when the work felt like it would never end. Caleb was a terrible patient. He hated being stuck in one place, frustrated by how weak he was and angry about having to depend on others when he'd always been the one people leaned on. "I ought to be out there," he said one afternoon, trying to sit up and turning white with pain right away. "You ought to be healing," Eliza said back, pushing him gently back down on the pillow. "The ranch is fine. Jesse's doing great work. Everything's taken care of. You're worn out. I can see it. I've been worn out before. I'll get through it. This ain't what I wanted," Caleb said, his voice bitter. "You nursing me like some invalid while all the ranch work piles up on you. What you want doesn't much matter right now. What you need is what matters." Eliza sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to bump his leg. "Caleb, you remember what you told me after I lost the foal? That sometimes you can do everything right, and it still ain't enough. That it doesn't make you a failure. It just means you're dealing with unpredictable things in an unpredictable world. That's different. It's exactly the same. You got thrown from your horse. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't something you could have stopped. Now you're doing everything right, listening to the doctor, resting, healing. That's all you can do." He closed his eyes. "I'm supposed to be your partner, an equal. Right now, I'm nothing but a burden. You're not a burden. You're someone I—" She stopped, the words getting stuck in her throat. Caleb's eyes opened and met hers. "Someone you what?" Eliza took a deep breath. This was not how she had pictured this conversation going. She always thought there'd be a perfect time, some romantic place, a chance to get her words just right. But life doesn't hand you perfect moments. It hands you this. The man she loved lying hurt in a bed, both of them bone-tired, the ranch barely staying afloat all around them. And maybe that was perfect in its own way, because this was real life. And real love happens right in the middle of all the hard stuff, not when everything's easy. "Someone I love," Eliza said, her voice quiet. "You asked me 3 days before the accident if I'd ever think about marrying you. I didn't answer because I was scared. Scared of needing somebody. Scared of depending on anybody. Scared of what would happen if I gave you my heart and you broke it. Eliza, let me finish. I've spent these last few weeks watching you hurt and realizing that I'm already all in. I already need you, I already depend on you, and I already love you so much that the thought of losing you makes it hard to breathe. Being scared of getting hurt doesn't change a single bit of that. It just means I'm wasting time that we could be spending building a life together." Tears were streaming down her face now, but she did not care. So she went on. "Yes, I will marry you, if that offer is still good. If you still want me after all these weeks of me being bossy and a pretty terrible nurse." Caleb reached up with his good hand and gently pulled her down into a kiss. It was a little clumsy and absolutely perfect, and it tasted of tears and hope and the feeling of finally coming home. "Yes, the offer is still open," he said, his voice soft when they finally pulled apart. "And I still want you. I will always want you. Even if I am a terrible cook." "Even then," Eliza laughed through her tears, "though we might have to hire someone for that eventually." Caleb just kissed her again. And somewhere in that moment, all the fear and the weariness and the worry just melted away, leaving behind something much simpler and much more true. It was a love that they had chosen on purpose, one built on a partnership and on respect, and on the kind of trust that can only be earned by getting through the hard times together. They were married quietly in March, with Jesse and Dr. Harrison as their witnesses, right there in the parlor of the ranch house. Caleb was still using crutches, as his leg was healing but not yet strong enough to walk on without help. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress, which she had altered so it would fit her. The ceremony was short, and the celebration was small, but when Caleb slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Eliza felt like she was the richest woman in the entire territory. "Partners," Caleb said softly, repeating the same word they had spoken when they signed their business papers all those months ago. "Partners," Eliza agreed, "in everything." And that night, as she lay beside her husband in the room that had been hers alone for so long, Eliza thought about what a long road she had traveled from that desperate day in October. She had been so sure back then that she had to do everything by herself, that accepting any help was a sign of weakness, and that depending on anyone else would only lead to being let down. How wrong she had been. The ranch was now theirs, in name and in fact completely. The cattle operation was growing larger. The horses were doing well, and Starlight was turning into exactly the kind of horse her father had always dreamed of breeding. And in the middle of all that practical success, she had found something that was worth so much more. She had found a partner who saw her as his equal, who loved her not in spite of her strength, but because of it. He was a man who had proved to her over and over again that some people really could be trusted with your whole heart. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, his voice sleepy in the dark. "That I am happy," Eliza said, and it was that simple. "For the first time since my parents passed away, I am truly and completely happy." Caleb carefully pulled her closer, mindful of his healing leg. "Good," he murmured. "Good, because this is just the beginning." And as she lay there in the quiet darkness, listening to the steady sound of her husband's breathing, Eliza believed him. It was the beginning of something that was going to last. Spring arrived with a kind of sudden explosive beauty that made the hard winter feel like a distant memory. The hills turned green almost overnight, and wildflowers covered the land in colors so bright they hardly seemed real. The cattle grew fat and content on the new grass, and the horses ran in the pastures, showing their pure joy at being free from the confinement of winter. Caleb's leg healed, slowly but surely. By April, he had moved on from crutches to a cane, and by May he had set that aside too, though he walked with a slight limp that Dr. Harrison said might be permanent. Eliza would sometimes catch him just standing at the fence, looking out over their land, with his hand unconsciously rubbing the leg that had almost cost him everything. Nearly took it all from him. "Does it still bother you?" she asked one evening as she came to stand beside him. "Every now and then," he answered. "Mostly it just makes me remember how fortunate I am." He faced her, his look turning serious. "I could have lost the whole leg. The infection could have been the end of me. But here I am, standing with my wife, watching our own cattle graze on our own land. It's hard to find a reason to complain about a limp when things could have been so much worse. Their land, their herd, their shared life." Those words sent a wave of satisfaction and pride through Eliza. Jesse had worked with them through the winter and all through spring, making himself indispensable. He had changed from a skinny 19-year-old into a seasoned ranch hand who had thoughts on managing cattle and the self-assurance to say them with respect. Caleb began showing him the finer details of choosing breeding stock, and Eliza had him help out with the horses. One afternoon in late May, Jesse came to them, holding his hat in his hands with a look that said he had something hard to talk about. "What's on your mind?" Caleb asked. "I've received an offer," Jesse said. "Jack Morrison wants me to come work for him. It could lead to a permanent foreman job. The pay is good, and it is a chance to learn the business from the very beginning." Eliza's heart just dropped. They had started to rely on Jesse, and what's more, she had grown to really like him. If he left, they would have to scramble to find a replacement, or they would have to go back to handling everything themselves. But Caleb's response was a surprise. "That is a fine opportunity," he said. Morrison runs a tight ship. You will learn a great deal over there. I would hate to leave you all in a bind, though, Jesse said, looking from one to the other. You have been mighty good to me. You taught me so much. It just feels wrong to leave now. It is not wrong to chase a better chance in life, Eliza said, even though the words were hard for her to say. When would you need to start? Morrison wants me there in 2 weeks. But if you need a little more time to find someone else, 2 weeks is plenty, Caleb said with a firm voice. We will figure it out. And Jesse, you earned this. Do not you feel one bit bad about moving on up? After Jesse was gone, Eliza turned to her husband. We cannot handle all this by ourselves. Not with the bigger herd and all the horses. I know that. But we cannot hold Jesse back just because we need him. That would not be right. So what are we going to do? Caleb stood there for a minute, lost in thought. We will hire 2 people, not one man trying to do everything, but 2 specialists. We need someone who knows cattle through and through, and someone with true expertise with horses. We will build a real crew instead of putting everything on one person's shoulders. It was a good idea, even if it meant more wages to pay. But the ranch was making good money now. The horse sales had been very strong all winter, and the cattle business was really starting to look promising. They could manage to invest in some quality help. Over the next week, they sent word around the territory that they were looking for hands. The number of replies was surprising. It turned out the Hartley-Mercer Ranch had earned a name for being a good place to work, with fair bosses who paid well and treated their people with respect. They talked to 5 different men for the cattle job and decided on a tough old cowboy named Tom Briggs. He had worked on outfits from Texas all the way to Montana and knew breeding stock like some folks know the good book. For the horse job, they came face to face with a candidate they never expected, Sarah Reeves. She was 42, lean as a whip with calloused hands, and a way of looking at horses that held the same keen understanding Eliza's father once had. She had been the stable master for a rich family back in Kentucky before she came out west. And she knew about bloodlines and training methods that Eliza had only ever read about. I am going to be straight with you, Sarah said, sitting across from them in the main house. Most outfits will not hire a woman for my kind of work. They think I cannot handle the job or that I will just stir up trouble. But I am the best horse trainer you will find anywhere in this territory. I am not too concerned about the pay as long as it is fair, and I get a chance to work with good quality animals. Eliza glanced at Caleb, saw the question in his expression, and gave a slight nod. You have got the job, Caleb said. You will get the same wages as Briggs, a spot in the new bunkhouse we are building, and a share in any horse you train personally, if it sells for more than a set price. Sarah's eyes went wide. A share? We believe in paying folks for good work, Eliza explained. My father always used to say the best way to make people care about quality is to give them a personal stake in how things turn out. If you make our horses better, you get a piece of the profit. It seems only right to us. That is more than right, Sarah said, her voice thick with feeling. When do you want me to start? They found a new rhythm with the larger crew. Tom took charge of the cattle, starting new grazing rotations and breeding plans that improved the quality of the herd. Within a few months, Sarah had worked her own kind of magic on the horses, taking Eliza's strong groundwork and improving on it with new methods that created exceptional animals. Buyers started coming from 3 territories away just to see them. And through it all, Caleb and Eliza were learning how to be partners in business while also being husband and wife. It was not always a simple thing. They had their disagreements over money, over what to focus on, and over whose knowledge should lead the way on certain choices. But they had built a habit early on of talking their way through problems instead of letting them boil over. They remembered they were on the same team, even when they did not see eye to eye on how to do things. In July, Eliza found out she was pregnant. She had thought so for a few weeks but kept it to herself, wanting to be sure before she got anyone's hopes up or caused any worry. When Dr. Harrison confirmed it, she sat in the wagon on the ride back home, trying to sort out her feelings. She was excited, of course, but she was also terrified. Her mother had passed away from a broken heart, but she had also gone through 3 miscarriages between the time Eliza was born and her father's death. Being pregnant was a dangerous business, and giving birth was even more so. Caleb was out mending a fence when she returned. She walked over to where he was working, her heart hammering in her chest. "I have to tell you something," she said. He looked up, his face filled with immediate concern. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. At least, I do not think so. I am pregnant." Caleb let the hammer fall from his hand. For a second he just looked at her, and she could not read his face at all. Then he was moving toward her, closing the space between them and wrapping her in his arms with a tenderness that brought a lump to her throat. "Are you happy about it?" he asked, his voice soft against her hair. "I am not sure," Eliza confessed. "I am scared. My mother—" "You are not your mother. And you are a strong woman, Eliza. You are stronger than anyone I've ever known. Women die during childbirth. Strong women, healthy women. But many, many more live right through it and have healthy children." He pulled away to look into her eyes. "We will get the finest care. Dr. Harrison will keep a close eye on everything, and I will be right there with you. You cannot be in there when the baby comes. That is just not the way it is done." "Well, then I will be just outside the door, near enough to hear you cussing me for getting you into this mess." Eliza could not help but laugh, even with her worries. "I reckon I might do that anyway." The pregnancy moved along just fine through the summer and into the fall. Eliza kept on working as long as she was able, but Caleb and Sarah schemed to keep her from the real heavy lifting. By October, a full year since Caleb first rode onto her ranch, she was too big to do much more than light chores and telling others what to do. One afternoon, she and Caleb sat on the porch, watching the sun go down over a piece of land that had changed completely in just 12 months. The cattle were grazing easy in the distance. The horses ran free in pastures with brand new fences. They had added on to the ranch house again, putting in real bedrooms for the family they were raising up. "Do you remember this day last year?" Eliza asked him. "Every last bit of it. You were standing right here on this porch, watching those men from the bank take stock of your whole life. And the look on your face when I paid off what you owed, like you could not figure if I was a fool or if you were dreaming." "I surely thought you were a fool," Eliza confessed, "paying $2,300 for a woman you had never even said a word to. It was the best money I ever spent. You did not know that at the time. I knew what I needed to know." He reached for her hand, weaving his fingers through hers. "I knew you were the kind of person who would fight for what was important. That was a gamble worth taking. Vernon Hastings had stopped by the ranch once in the early summer, saying he needed to check on the property's value for the bank's paperwork. But Eliza figured he was really just hoping to see that they had gone bust. Instead, what he found was a place that was thriving, with healthy animals, good folks working there, and improvements that had made the land worth a whole lot more. "You've done well," he had said, though he could not quite keep the disappointment out of his voice. "We've done well," Eliza corrected him, making sure he heard the we. "My husband and I." She took a special kind of satisfaction in watching him ride off, knowing he would have to go back and tell his bosses that the Hartley-Mercer ranch was not just getting by, but was actually turning a good profit. A little mean part of her hoped it bothered him something fierce. In December, as the first anniversary of Sage's hard birth came near, Eliza's time came. It was late in the afternoon, with the winter sun already dropping low when the first pains started. Caleb sent Tom riding like the devil was on his tail to go get Dr. Harrison, and he asked Sarah to stay with Eliza while he wore a path in the floor, pacing like a trapped cougar. The labor was long, nearly 20 hours, but it was not a difficult one. Dr. Harrison watched over everything with great care, and Sarah stayed right by Eliza's side, giving her that plain, no-nonsense kind of help that did more good than a bunch of empty words ever could have. When the baby finally made his entrance, screaming and absolutely perfect, Dr. Harrison laid the little one in Eliza's arms and said, "You have a son, and by the sound of those lungs, he's as healthy as a young colt." Caleb was allowed to come in then, and the look on his face when he laid eyes on his son for the very first time was something Eliza knew she would never forget. It was a mix of pure awe, a little bit of terror, and a love so big it filled the room. "He's perfect," Caleb whispered, gently touching a tiny hand with his finger, which looked impossibly huge next to it. "We did good work." Eliza said, worn out but feeling more alive than ever. You did the tough part. We'll just call it even. They decided to name him Samuel after Caleb's father. Samuel Mercer, born on December 20th, 1887, on a ranch that had almost been lost forever, but had instead become the cornerstone of something that would last. The months that followed Samuel's birth were a dizzying mix of sleepless nights and learning as they went. Eliza thought she understood hard work, but looking after a newborn while she was still healing from childbirth was a challenge unlike any other. Caleb helped out as much as was considered proper, walking the floors with a fussy baby at 3 a.m, changing diapers without a word of complaint, and handling night feedings when Eliza was just too tired to even move. Sarah turned out to be a surprising blessing, having raised her own younger brothers and sisters back in Kentucky. She showed Eliza little tricks for calming a crying baby and how to handle the crazy balancing act of running a ranch and being a mother. By the time spring rolled around, they had settled into a routine. Samuel was sleeping through the night more often than he was waking. Eliza was back to working on the ranch at least part of the day, and things were running so smoothly that they could sometimes sneak a day for themselves without the whole place falling to pieces. One afternoon in May, Caleb walked into the house and found Eliza nursing Samuel in the old rocking chair her daddy had built for her mama. "I've got some news," he said. "Good or bad?" "Good, real good. I just sold 3 yearlings to a fella from California. He's starting up a breeding program out that way and wants our bloodline to be his foundation stock." "How much?" Eliza asked, although she could already see the answer in Caleb's smile. "Enough to pay off the last of what we owe for the expansion and put a good chunk of money in savings. We're completely clear, Eliza. No more debt, a healthy amount put away, and orders coming in faster than we can keep up." She knew they were doing all right, but hearing him say it so directly made it feel real in a way it hadn't before. They had really done it. They had taken a ranch on the brink of failure and made it a success in less than 2 years. "My father would be so proud," she said, her voice soft. "He would be in awe of you. You took what he started and made it even better than he likely ever dreamed." "We did," Eliza corrected him. "I couldn't have done a single bit of this without you." Caleb sat down in the chair across from her. "Remember when you were so scared of relying on anybody? Thought it was a sign of weakness? I was a fool. You were scared. There's a big difference." He paused for a moment. "But just look at what we built together because you took a chance and trusted someone. Not just the ranch, even though that's mighty impressive, but this," he said, gesturing to the room around them. "A family, a home, a life that neither one of us could have ever made on our own." He was right. Every single good thing in Eliza's life had come from that one frightening choice to accept help, to become a partner, to trust another soul with her dreams and her future. In June, Sarah came to them with some news of her own. She and Tom Briggs had been courting, something everyone on the ranch knew but was polite enough not to mention, and they had decided to get married. "I'd understand if you needed to let one of us go," Sarah said. "Having married folks on the payroll can make things complicated." "Why on earth would we let either of you go?" Caleb asked, looking truly baffled. "You're both the best at what you do. What y'all do in your own time is your own affair." They were married in July, a simple little get-together at the ranch, and Caleb and Eliza gifted them the brand-new cabin as a wedding present. Having 2 married couples running the ranch changed things up again, but all for the better. Tom and Sarah brought a kind of steadiness and long-term commitment that you just never got from single ranch hands. The years that came after were a familiar mix of good times and hard times, the usual story of life on a ranch. There were prosperous years when cattle prices were up and the horses found buyers quickly, and there were lean years when a lack of rain or a dip in the market put their grit to the test. They lost animals to sickness and accidents. They celebrated new births, and they mourned their losses. Samuel grew from a baby to a toddler, then into a little boy who trailed his father around the ranch like a second shadow, already soaking up the work that would one day be his. When he turned 3, Eliza gave birth to a daughter they named Grace, for the amazing grace that had seen them all through. Grace was nothing like Samuel. Where he was thoughtful and careful, she was a wild little thing with no fear, always climbing on things she shouldn't, and riding horses before she could hardly even walk. She reminded Eliza so much it almost hurt of her own mother, with that same powerful spirit that just refused to be boxed in by what was expected. By the time a full decade had gone by since that October day Caleb had ridden in and saved her ranch, Eliza sometimes had to just stop and take it all in, to wonder at how her life had been so completely remade. The Hartley Mercer Ranch was known across 3 territories as the #1 place to get working horses with real grit and smarts. Their cattle business, while not as big as some, was making good money and growing every year. They had even bought the neighboring property when it went up for sale, giving them more land for grazing. They had built a proper bunkhouse for the hands they hired on for the season, a whole separate barn for their breeding horses, and a little schoolhouse for the children that the other ranch families in the area used too. But more than all the buildings and the land, Eliza cherished the life they had built right there inside of it all. Samuel, now 10 years old, was already showing his father's steady patience and his mother's natural way with horses. Grace, at 7, could outride boys twice her age and had her own ideas about raising cattle that sometimes made Tom just laugh out loud in surprise. One evening in late October of 1896, Eliza and Caleb were sitting on the porch, just like they had done hundreds of times before. The children were tucked in bed and fast asleep. The ranch was peaceful, with just the usual night sounds of animals settling down and the wind rustling through the tall grass. 10 years, Eliza said softly. Almost to the very day, Caleb answered. October 15th was the day the bank was going to foreclose. I can hardly even recall being that scared woman, standing right here on this porch watching those men from the bank counting up my life. I remember her. She was something else. Scared, sure, but she was not broken. That's how I knew for certain. Certain about what? That you were worth saving. That this ranch was worth saving. That putting everything I had on a complete stranger was the smartest bet I was ever going to make. Eliza leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, feeling a sense of comfort she had never imagined she could feel with another person. Do you ever sit and wonder what might have happened if you hadn't ridden up that day? Sometimes. You would have lost the ranch, probably found work in town somewhere. Maybe you would have ended up marrying some safe, boring man. And you would have kept on looking for land, probably found a piece eventually, but it would not have been this. It would not have lucky. We got lucky, Eliza said. We got brave, Caleb corrected her. Lucky is when something just lands in your lap. Brave is when you decide to take a chance on something that really matters. We both did that. You did, by agreeing to a partnership, and I did, by offering one. Everything that came after that was just plain hard work. He was right, as he so often was. Maybe luck had brought him to her ranch on that one day, but everything that happened after was built on choice, on sticking to it, and on a stubborn will to make it all work out. A door creaked open inside, and Samuel came out, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Mama, I dreamed about Grandfather, the one who built this place. Eliza's throat felt tight. Samuel had never known his grandfather, but they spoke of him all the time, keeping his memory alive with their stories. What did you dream about? She asked him. He said to tell you he is proud of you, that you made his dream even bigger and better than he ever thought it could be. Samuel yawned. Is that a silly thing to dream? No, sweetheart, Eliza said, with tears welling in her eyes. That is not silly at all. After Samuel was put back to bed, Caleb found Eliza in her father's old study. She was just looking at the breeding books that went back 30 years. Her father's handwriting filled the first pages. Her own writing took over in the middle section. And now Caleb's notes were showing up regularly, too. Your father really would be proud, Caleb said from the doorway. I know. I just wish he could have seen it. I wish he could have met his grandchildren and known that everything he worked for was not lost. Maybe he can see it. Who is to say what is possible? Caleb came and stood next to her. But even if he cannot, his legacy is right here in these books, in those horses, and in our children who will keep this work going. That is a kind of living forever, kind. Elijah closed the record book gently. When Samuel gets a little older, he needs to learn how to keep these books. It is important to keep the family tradition alive. And Grace, too. That girl has a natural gift for understanding cattle, and it would be a shame to waste it just because she is a girl. They will both learn everything there is to know, and then they can choose for themselves what they want to do on this ranch. Your daddy would have liked that, Caleb said. After all, he raised you to take over this place. They walked back toward their bedroom as the house settled into a peaceful quiet. Eliza thought about how much this room had changed through the years. It used to be her parents' room. Then it was just hers after they passed away. Later, it became their room when she and Caleb got married. Now it was the very heart of a home that held not just the two of them, but their children, their hands who had become like family, and all the dreams they had turned into reality. The next morning, Eliza woke up and saw Caleb was already awake. He was standing by the window, just looking out across the ranch. She went over to him, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind. Together, they watched the sun come up over the land they had fought so hard to keep. "What is on your mind?" she asked him. "I'm just feeling grateful for every bit of it, the good years and the hard ones, the victories and the mistakes, every single moment that got us to right here. Even your broken leg, even that. It taught us we could get through a crisis together, that we could take care of one another when things got tough." Samuel showed up at their door with Grace right behind him. Both kids were ready for breakfast and whatever adventures the day would bring. Eliza and Caleb shared a look that held 10 years of partnership, of a love that had been tested and proven true, of dreams they built together from nothing more than faith and pure, stubborn grit. They went downstairs as a family. Eliza got breakfast started while Caleb gave the children their morning chores. Out the window, she could see Tom and Sarah walking toward the barn. In the distance, the cattle were grazing, and she could see horses running free in pastures her own father had fenced in decades ago. This was her life now. It was not the one she might have expected, but it was better than anything she could have ever dreamed up. She had lost everything once: her parents, her sense of security, the belief that just working hard was enough to get by. But in losing all of that, she had found something so much more precious. She had found a true partner, love, a family, and a future that was built on trust instead of fear. Later that morning, after the breakfast dishes were put away and the children were busy with their lessons, Caleb found Eliza in the barn. She was checking on a mare that was about to have her foal. "I have been thinking," he said. "Maybe it is time we made this official." "Make what official?" "The name of the ranch. We have been calling it the Hartley Mercer Ranch for a while now, but the deed still just says Hartley. I think we ought to change that. Make it clear that this place belongs to both of us." Eliza thought about that for a moment. Her father's name on that deed was the last official tie she had to him. It was the final piece of paper that said this ranch was his first. But she knew holding on to the past was not the way to honor it. Building on what he started was. "Yes," she said, "let us do that. The Hartley Mercer Ranch, officially and legally." They rode into town the very next week and filed all the paperwork. The clerk at the courthouse did not even bat an eye. Everybody in the whole territory already knew them as the Hartley Mercer operation anyway. But seeing it written down for real with both their names claiming equal ownership felt like closing one book and starting a brand new one. On the ride back home, Caleb said, "You know what I have never done?" "What is that?" "Properly, thank you." "For what?" "For saying yes. For taking a gamble on a man you did not know from Adam. For building this life with me, even when you were scared to death." "I ought to be the one thanking you," Eliza said back. "You saved everything I had." "We saved each other," Caleb cut in. "You gave me a place to call home, a reason to live that was bigger than just getting by and saving up money. You gave me a family that is worth more than any debt I ever paid." They rode on for a while in a comfortable silence. The autumn sun felt warm on their faces, and the land around them was as familiar as an old friend. "Caleb," Eliza finally said. Yeah? I'm so glad you rode up that day. I am glad you were crazy enough to pay off a complete stranger's debt. I am glad for all of it. The partnership, the marriage, the children, the whole life we have built. Every single piece of it, even when I drive you crazy. Especially then, he teased. It just means you care enough to be a little annoying. He laughed, and the sound of it filled Eliza with a sense of peace so deep it almost took her breath away. She realized this was what her father had truly wanted for her. It was not just about having a successful ranch, but about having a full life. A life with love, family, purpose, and a partner to share it all with. She had found every bit of it, and then some. As they came over the last hill before their home, the ranch spread out below them in all its hard-won glory. The house her father had built was bigger now, expanded to hold their growing family. The barns and corrals and pastures had been improved and were maintained with a careful hand. The cattle and horses were the result of years of careful breeding and hard work. And standing right there in the yard, watching for them to come home, were two children who were the future of everything they had built. Samuel waved the second he saw them, and Grace started running for the road, not caring one bit about the dust or her mother's definite disapproval of her running wild. Our daughter does not have a lick of fear in her, Caleb noted with a smile. She gets that from you. Me? I am always cautious. You paid $2,300 for a man you had never even met. That is not what I call cautious. That was not fearlessness. That was certainty. I knew what had to be done, so I just did it. Eliza thought about that as they rode the last stretch home. Maybe that was the real lesson she had learned over these 10 years. It was not that fear was not real or that you should ignore it, but that being certain about what really matters could help you push right through it. She had been terrified the day she accepted Caleb's offer of a partnership. She was terrified when she agreed to marry him. She had been terrified through every birth and loss and crisis they had ever faced. But buried deep beneath all that fear, there had been a certainty. A certainty that this partnership was important, that this love was worth fighting for, that this life they were building together deserved every single ounce of courage she could find. They swung down from their saddles in the yard, and Grace ran right into Eliza's legs with all the force of a 7-year-old's excitement. "Mama, come and see. The mare had her baby." "Which mare?" Eliza asked, but her heart was already pounding in her chest. They had 3 that were due any day now. The one Papa said was special. The granddaughter of Ranger. Eliza and Caleb looked at each other and hurried to the barn. And there, in the clean stall they had prepared, stood a mare with a brand-new filly beside her. And that little filly, was perfect. She had Ranger's strong build, her mother's intelligent eyes, and a coat that seemed to shine even in the dim light of the barn. "She is the one," Eliza whispered, knowing deep down that this was the horse that would lift their breeding program to a whole new level. Papa would have loved her. "What should we name her?" Samuel asked, suddenly appearing at Eliza's side. Eliza looked at the little filly, then at her children, at her husband, and at the barn her father had built and that she had expanded. She looked at the life that had almost been lost, but was saved and turned into something that neither she nor her father could have ever imagined on their own. "Hope," she said. "We will call her Hope. Because that is what this whole journey has really been about. It was about hope that hard work would pay off in the end. Hope that you could actually trust people. Hope that love was worth taking a chance on. Hope that what was broken could be fixed, that what was lost could be found again, and hope that what seemed impossible could be done with a partner, with persistence, and with a little bit of faith." That night, long after the children were asleep and the ranch was quiet, Eliza and Caleb sat out on the porch one more time. The stars were shining bright overhead, the air was crisp with the promise of the coming winter, and the land all around them was peaceful. "10 years ago today," Caleb said, "I rode onto this ranch a total stranger and ended up changing both of our lives forever. Best decision either one of us ever made," Eliza said. "I would do it all over again," Caleb said. Every single bit of it, every hard choice, every crisis, every moment I ever had a doubt. Because it all led me right here, to this porch, to this life, to you, to everything that really matters. Eliza took his hand, weaving her fingers through his in a way that felt as natural as breathing. You did not just pay off a debt that day, you know. No, you gave us a future, both of us. And we built it together, one piece at a time, into something neither of us could have ever made by ourselves. That is what a partnership is all about, Caleb said softly. That is what love is. Two people building something that is bigger and stronger than what either one could manage alone. They sat there in the dark, holding hands, looking out over their land, living in the life they had fought for and won. Somewhere inside the house, their children were sleeping safe and sound. Out in the barn, Hope, the little filly who stood for everything they had accomplished, was nursing from her mother. All across the ranch, their employees were resting, confident that tomorrow would bring more honest work and fair treatment. This is what success really looks like, Eliza thought to herself. It was not just about being financially stable or running a thriving operation, even though those things were important. It was about this partnership, this family, this purpose, this feeling of belonging. It was the knowledge that you had taken something that was broken and made it whole again. That you had risked absolutely everything and won not just security, but real joy. The dust storm that had swept across these plains 10 years ago had carried away the woman Eliza used to be. A woman who was scared, all alone, and desperate. In her place now stood someone stronger. Someone who had learned that being vulnerable was not a weakness, and that asking for help can sometimes be the bravest thing a person can do. She had needed saving on that October day, and Caleb had been there to save her. But he had needed saving too. He needed saving from a life of endless work that had no real purpose, from the loneliness of not having a place to belong, from the empty feeling of reaching goals that did not mean anything. They had saved each other, and by doing that, they had built something that would last long after they were gone. A ranch, a family, a legacy of partnership and of love. I love you, Eliza said into the quiet darkness. I love you too, Caleb replied, now and always. And as they sat there on the porch of the home they had built together, standing on this porch, looking out at all we've fought for, Eliza knew down to her bones that this life was the one her daddy had envisioned. He dreamed of this very thing when he first broke ground on this Texas soil all those years ago. He wanted more than just getting by. He wanted his family to flourish. He wanted more than just hard work. He wanted real joy. This wasn't just a ranch to him, it was a home. They had taken that dream and raised it up bigger and stronger, making it their own. And Lord willing, they would hand it down to their kids, who would build their own dreams on this same foundation for generations to come. She'd never forget the day the Cowboy showed up, right when they were about to foreclose. He paid off every single dollar she owed and ran them off the property. But the thing that changed everything, the thing that mattered most, was that he stayed. He became her partner. He gave her his love. He helped her build. And side by side, they built a future that was worth every single struggle, every sacrifice, and every last moment of doubt. This was their story. This was their victory. This was finally home. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.